The day specialist Sarah Miller stood in the rain outside Building 4 to 2843 at Fort Liberty and watched her father's motorcade roll past. She was thinking less about the 3 stars on his bumper and more about the specific way he always checked his watch. Left wrist, 2 taps on the crystal, before he decided someone's fate. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of North Carolina morning where the humidity feels like a wet wool blanket, and the smell of pine needles and diesel exhaust hangs heavy over the motor pools. Sarah stood at a perfect, anonymous parade rest, her boots pressing into the softening asphalt, her eyes fixed on a point exactly 3 inches above the horizon. She was one of 100 soldiers lining the route, a single pixel in a digital camouflage landscape, utterly invisible to the man in the back of the black SUV. General Arthur Vance did not look out the window. He was looking at a tablet, his profile sharp and silvered, the same profile that stared back at Sarah every morning when she brushed her teeth and pulled her hair into a regulation bun. He didn't know she was there. He didn't know she had been at Liberty for 6 months. He didn't even know she was still in the country. To him, she was still the daughter who had walked out of their Great Falls home 3 years ago after a dinner that ended in the kind of silence that breaks foundations. Sarah Miller, born Sarah Vance, did not flinch as the motorcade splashed through a puddle, sending a spray of grit toward her shins. She was emotionally controlled, a trait she had inherited from the man now passing her by. In the Army, they called it discipline. In the Vance household, it had just been the way you survived a Tuesday. She felt the cold water seep into her socks, but she didn't move. She didn't have to. She had learned how to turn off the parts of her brain that complained about discomfort long before she'd ever met a drill sergeant. She'd learned it at age 7, sitting at a mahogany dining table while her father explained the necessity of collateral damage in the 1990s. She'd learned it at 12, when her mother had stayed in bed for 3 weeks, and Sarah had quietly run the household, filing the bills and packing her own lunches, never once asking for help. She was a 35P, a cryptologic linguist, though her official file in the company office at the 82nd Airborne Division didn't reflect the full scope of what she could do. On paper, she was proficient in Levantine Arabic and Farsi. In reality, Sarah possessed a frightening, almost neurological ability to perceive patterns in noise. It wasn't just language, it was the architecture of sound. She could hear the difference between a mechanical failure and a deliberate jamming signal by the flavor of the static. She could listen to a crowded market intercept and tell you which man was lying not by his words, but by the rhythmic hitch in his breathing that suggested a concealed weapon. It was a talent that bordered on the synesthetic, a hidden capability she kept tucked behind a mask of mid-level competence. She did enough to be respected, but never enough to be noticed. Being noticed was dangerous. Being noticed led to questions, and questions led back to the general. After the motorcade vanished toward the division headquarters, the formation was dismissed. Sarah walked back toward the SIF, the sensitive compartmented information facility, a windowless concrete box where she spent 10 hours a day wearing heavy headsets and staring at cascading waterfalls of green and amber data. The air inside the SIF always smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the damp woods outside. "Miller, you're on the Sughat sweep," Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne said as she walked in. Thorne was a man made of leather and gristle, a career non-commissioned officer who had lost 2 toes in a valley Sarah was currently mapping. He was the only person in the unit who didn't quite buy Sarah's, just another soldier act. He watched her too closely, his eyes lingering on the way she handled her workstation, with a precision that suggested she had been briefed on the equipment by the people who had designed it. "Roger, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, professional, a Midwestern neutral she had practiced until her natural Virginia Hunt country lilt was buried under layers of gravel. She sat at her terminal, the familiar weight of the David Clark headset settling over her ears. The world narrowed. The hum of the room faded, replaced by the ghost whisper of the electromagnetic spectrum over the Sughat Valley. For 3 weeks, the 82nd had been preparing for a stabilization mission in the region. The briefings were standard. Low-level insurgency, crumbling infrastructure, a local population caught between a weak central government and a fading warlord. It was the kind of mission the Army could do in its sleep. But Sarah wasn't sleeping. She began the sweep, her fingers dancing over the keys with a grace she didn't show in the motor pool. She tuned the receiver to the 400 megahertz range, a graveyard of old radio traffic and industrial noise. Most analysts ignored it. It was too messy, too filled with the clutter of old Soviet-era power grids and pirate radio, but Sarah liked the clutter. Clutter was where people hid things. She found it 40 minutes into her shift. It was a pulse, short, rhythmic, and buried under the cycling hum of a regional water pump. To anyone else, it was just a harmonic vibration, a mechanical glitch. But to Sarah, it had a shape. It was a dead-hand signal, a legacy Soviet protocol designed to trigger automated systems if human operators were neutralized. Except this wasn't Soviet. The encryption layer was modern. It was a digital heartbeat, slow and steady, waiting for a command. Sarah paused, her thumb hovering over the mark button. She felt a cold prickle of sweat at the base of her neck. The tempo of the signal was 72 beats per minute, a human resting heart rate. It wasn't just a signal, it was a tether. "Thorne," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The staff sergeant leaned over her shoulder, the smell of wintergreen tobacco following him. "What you got, Miller?" "Something's wrong with the Sughat grid," she said, pointing at the amber spikes on her screen. "Look at the interval, it's too consistent for a mechanical fault, it's masking something." Thorne squinted at the screen. He was a good analyst, but he didn't see the architecture, he saw the spikes. "Looks like a pump jack feedback, Miller. The Sughat refinery is 30 miles south. We've been seeing that harmonic for years." "The refinery's harmonic is 68 beats per minute, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said, her eyes not leaving the screen. "This is 72, and the frequency is shifted by 0.5 hertz. Someone is using the refinery's noise to hide a trigger." Thorne paused. He looked at Sarah, then back at the screen. For a second, she saw the flick of doubt in his eyes, the realization that he was looking at something he didn't understand, being explained by a specialist who shouldn't understand it either. "I'll put it in the report," Thorne said, but his voice lacked conviction. "But don't get your hopes up. The LT is looking for hard intel on IED cells, not ghost signals in the power grid." "It's not a ghost," Sarah said. Thorne patted her shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be condescending but felt more like a warning. "Write it up, Miller. Just keep it brief. We've got a long day." Sarah watched him walk away. She felt the controlled rage begin to simmer in her chest, the familiar cold heat of being right and being ignored. It was the same rage she had felt when she was 10 and told her father the neighbor's construction project was actually a drainage violation that would flood their basement. He had laughed and told her to focus on her piano lessons. 2 weeks later, the basement had been under 3 feet of water. He hadn't apologized. He had just bought a bigger pump and told her that leaders don't dwell on the past. She began to type. She didn't keep it brief. She detailed the frequency shift, the heartbeat rhythm, and the potential for a remote detonated network. She used the technical language of a senior signals intelligence officer, the kind of terminology her father used when he thought no one was listening. Then, before she hit send, she paused. She looked at her name on the screen, *Miller, Sarah E. SBC. She went back and deleted the technical jargon. She simplified the language. She made it sound like a guess, a specialist's hunch. If she sounded too smart, they would dig. If they dug, they would find her. She hit send and watched the report disappear into the digital maw of the 82 ND's intelligence wing. 2 floors up, in a room that smelled of expensive leather and air filtration, General Arthur Vance sat at a conference table. He was surrounded by colonels and brigadier generals, men who had built their careers on his coattails. On the table was the deployment order for the Sughat Valley. It was a 400-page document, the result of 6 months of planning. It was a masterpiece of logistics and strategic positioning. "The valley is a soft target, sir," a colonel named Higgins said, tapping a map with a silver pen. "The local militias are fragmented. We move in, establish the perimeter, and the infrastructure projects begin by month 2. It's a textbook win." Vance looked at the map. He saw the Sughat Valley not as a place where people lived and died, but as a series of vectors. He saw the supply lines, the high ground, the political leverage. He didn't see the 72-beat-per-minute pulse buried in the power grid. He didn't see the specialist in the SIF who was currently clenching her jaw so hard her teeth ached. "The intel is solid?" Vance asked. His voice was a resonant baritone, the kind of voice that commanded a room without needing to be loud. "Solid as a rock, sir," Higgins said. "Signals, human intel, and satellite all point to the same thing, a vacuum of power. We just need to fill it." Vance picked up a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen, a gift from a foreign dignitary. He didn't check his watch. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what time it was. It was time to move. He signed the order with a flourish, his signature a sharp, aggressive scrawl that had been the final word on thousands of lives. Asterisk deployment order 82-0 Sughat. Authorization. Vance A. Asterisk he didn't know that 3 pages down in a sub-appendix of minor signals anomalies, a specialist named Miller had noted a heartbeat in the static. He didn't read the sub-appendices. Generals didn't have time for the noise. They only had time for the signal. Downstairs, Sarah saw the notification pop up on her screen. Asterisk order signed. Mission active. Asterisk she looked at the digital signature. She felt a strange, hollow sensation in her stomach. It was the feeling of a trap springing and realizing you were the one who had seen the wire but couldn't stop the foot from falling. "Pack your bags, Miller," Thorne said, leaning over the partition. "We're wheels up in 72 hours. Looks like you're getting your wish. You'll be on the ground in Sughat with the advance party." Sarah didn't look up. She was watching the waterfall display. The 72-beat pulse had just changed. It was now 84 beats per minute, the heart rate of someone who had started running. "Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice incredibly calm. "The signal just accelerated. The pump jack, Miller, forget the pump jack. Go to the laundry, get your gear sorted. You're in the Army now, act like it." Sarah stood up. She was 5'6", but in that moment she felt like she was towering over the room. She looked at Thorne, her eyes cold and precise. "I am acting like it, Staff Sergeant. That's the problem." She walked out of the SIF, her gait measured and controlled. She didn't head for the laundry. She headed for the barracks, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. She knew what the Sughat Valley was. It wasn't a soft target. It was a lung, and someone was about to stop the breathing. As she walked across the quad, the rain began to fall harder. She passed a group of young privates, boys from places like Ohio and Texas who were laughing and talking about the girls they'd miss and the beer they'd drink when they got back. They looked at her, a quiet, plain-faced specialist with a blank expression, and they saw nothing. They didn't see the woman who had spent her childhood playing chess against a 3-star general and winning. They didn't see the woman who could hear a war coming before the first shot was fired. In her room, Sarah sat on her bunk and opened a small, locked footlocker. Inside wasn't much. A few books, a spare pair of glasses, and a single photograph she hadn't looked at in a year. It was a photo of her at 17, standing next to her father at a West Point gala. She was wearing a silk dress that felt like a cage, and he had his arm around her shoulder, his hand heavy and possessive. She looked miserable. He looked like he owned the world. She took a lighter from her pocket and held the flame to the corner of the photo. She watched the silk dress curl and blacken. She watched her father's face disappear into ash. She didn't feel sad. She didn't feel happy. She just felt the weight of the mission. The general had signed the order. He had sent his daughter into the path of a heartbeat he refused to hear. And now, Sarah Vance, the woman who didn't exist, had 72 hours to figure out how to save 2,000 men from her father's certainty. The next morning, the base was a hive of controlled chaos. The 82nd was the All-American Division, and when they moved, the earth shook. The air was filled with the scream of turbines as C-17s and C-130s lined up on the tarmac at Pope Field. Long lines of Humvees and Strykers were being winched into the bellies of the planes. The smell of JP-8 fuel was everywhere, a sweet, sickly scent that Sarah would always associate with the beginning of things. She was assigned to the Tactical Operations Center, TOC, for the initial sweep. It was a prestigious slot for a specialist, earned through her high scores and Thorne's grudging recognition of her hunch. But she knew the real reason. The unit was short-handed on linguists who could handle the high-stress environment of an initial drop. "Miller, you're with 1st Platoon, Bravo Company," Major Grahams told her during the final manifest check. Grahams was a man who lived for spreadsheets. He didn't look at Sarah's face. He looked at her MOS code and her security clearance. "You'll be embedded with the lead element to provide real-time SIGINT. Stay on the radio, keep your head down, and if you hear anything that sounds like a coordination call, you scream." "Understood, Major," Sarah said. She was wearing her full kit now, body armor, helmet, M4 carbine slung over her shoulder. The weight of the gear was familiar, a physical pressure that helped ground her. The ceramic plates pressed against her chest, a reminder of how little there was between her and the world. As she boarded the transport, she saw her father one last time. He was standing on the edge of the tarmac, surrounded by a gaggle of officers and a news crew. He was giving a speech about the noble work of stabilization and the unwavering resolve of the American soldier. His voice carried over the roar of the engines, a distant, theatrical thunder. Sarah stepped into the dark maw of the C-17. She didn't look back. The flight was 10 hours of vibrating metal and the smell of sweat. Sarah sat on the red webbing of the troop seats, her eyes closed, but she wasn't sleeping. She was listening. She had her portable receiver patched into her headset, scanning the long-range frequencies as they crossed the Atlantic. The dead hand signal was still there, but it had changed again. It was no longer a heartbeat. It was a countdown. The pulses were becoming shorter, the intervals narrowing with a mathematical precision that made her blood run cold. She arrived at the forward operating base, FOB, Bastion in the Sughat Valley at 0300 local time. The air was dry and tasted of dust and ancient stone. The valley was a jagged scar between two mountain ranges, a place where the sun didn't reach the floor until 10 in the morning. The FOB was a collection of Hesco bastions, plywood shacks, and humming generators. "Welcome to the end of the world, Miller," Thorne said as they stepped off the ramp. He looked tired, the gray in his beard more prominent under the harsh floodlights of the airfield. "Get your gear to the TOC tent. We'll live in 4 hours." Sarah hauled her rucksack through the dust. She felt the eyes of the infantryman on her, the embedded specialist, the girl in the TOC. They didn't know her, but they knew she was a POG, person other than grunt. They treated her with a distant, professional politeness that was its own kind of dismissal. She didn't mind. She preferred being a ghost. Inside the TOC, the air was thick with the sound of a dozen radios. Maps were projected onto screens, showing the valley floor in shades of green and gray. The first platoon was already gearing up for their first patrol. Hearts and Minds walked through the local village of Alfara. Sarah set up her workstation in a corner of the tent, away from the main hub of activity. She bypassed the standard filters and went straight to the 400 megahertz range. The signal was gone. She froze, her fingers hovering over the dials. She scanned the range again, nothing but the flat, empty hiss of the atmosphere. That was worse. A signal that stopped was a signal that had reached its conclusion. It was a zero state. "Major Graham's," Sarah said, standing up. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the tent. Graham's, who was pointing at a map for a captain, looked up, annoyed. "What is it, Miller? We're in the middle of a briefing." "The Sughat harmonic has stopped, sir," Sarah said. She walked over to the map, ignoring the surprised looks from the other officers. "The signal I reported at Liberty, it's gone dark." "So the pump jack broke," Graham said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or the power failed. It happens every day in this country, specialist. Get back to your station." "It's not the power, sir," Sarah said. She felt the controlled rage rising, but she kept her voice steady. "The signal didn't fade, it terminated. In a dead-hand protocol, termination means the condition has been met. The system is live." "What condition?" the captain asked, looking between Sarah and Graham's. "I don't know," Sarah said, "but first platoon is about to walk into the center of the grid." Graham stepped toward her, his face reddening. He was a foot taller than her, and he used his size to try and intimidate. "Specialist Miller, let me be very clear. You are here to translate radio traffic. You are not a strategic analyst. You are not an intelligence officer. You are a specialist. If I wanted your opinion on dead-hand protocols, I would have asked for it. Now, sit down, put your headset on, and do your job before I have you on the first bird back to brag for insubordination." The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant thud of a mortar tube on the practice range. Sarah looked at Graham's. She didn't blink. She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of a man who was out of his depth and was clinging to his rank as a life jacket. She saw the same look she'd seen on her father's face when he was losing an argument. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. She sat back down. She put her headset on, but she didn't tune to the translation frequencies. She began to build her own map. She used the historical data she'd memorized, the locations of every Soviet-era power substation in the valley. She layered them over the current troop movements. She saw the pattern immediately. The first platoon wasn't just walking into a village. They were walking into a focal point. The power lines in the valley weren't just carrying electricity. They were a giant antenna. She looked at her watch. 0545. She looked at the radio manifest. First platoon was 5 minutes from the village limits. Sarah felt the fear then. It wasn't movie fear. It wasn't a scream. It was a cold, buzzing vibration in her hands. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She had seen the schematics for this kind of area denial system in her father's private files when she was 15. He had called it the electric blanket, a way to neutralize an entire valley's electronics and communications, leaving an invading force blind, deaf, and trapped in a bowl of stone. She looked at Thorne. He was watching her. He saw her hands. He saw the way she was staring at the screen. He got up and walked over to her. "Miller," he whispered. "What is it?" "They are going to lose comms," she said, her voice a ghost of a sound. "In 3 minutes, everything in this valley that runs on a microchip is going to fry. The talk, the radios, the strikers, everything." Thorne looked at the screens, then back at her. "That's impossible. They don't have that kind of tech here." "They don't need it," Sarah said. "They just need the grid. They've been building it for 10 years under our noses, calling it infrastructure repair. My father signed the order to fund half of it through the stabilization grants." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just signed the deployment order. He had built the trap. He had done it with the same blind certainty that had governed her entire life. He had seen progress on a spreadsheet and hadn't looked at the architecture of the signal. "I have to stop them," Sarah said. "You can't," Thorne said, grabbing her arm. "If you break radio silence with an unauthorized warning, Graham's will have you in a cage." "If I don't, first platoon is dead," Sarah said. "They're being watched, Sergeant. The 84-beat pulse, that was the triggerman's heart rate. He's waiting for them to reach the fountain in the center of the square." She looked at the clock, 0548. Sarah Miller didn't beg. She didn't ask for permission. She reached out and flipped the master override switch on the TOC's communication hub, a switch she wasn't supposed to know existed. All units," she said, her voice ringing out over every frequency in the valley, her natural Virginia accent finally breaking through, authoritative and cold. "This is a red echo warning. The grid is hot. I repeat, the grid is hot. Abandon all electronic vehicles and move to high ground immediately. Do not use the radios. Do not stay in the square. Move now." The TOC erupted. Graham's was screaming. MPs were moving toward her. Thorne was standing between her and the major, his face a mask of shock. "Specialist Miller, get away from that console." Graham's roared. Sarah didn't move. She held the override button down. She looked at the screen. At 0549, the world went white. A massive electromagnetic pulse, channeled through the valley's power lines, tore through the atmosphere. In the TOC, every monitor exploded in a shower of sparks. The lights went out. The hum of the generators died a screaming death. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sarah had ever heard. Outside, the sunrise was just hitting the tops of the mountains. But in the Sughat Valley, the modern world had just ended. Sarah sat in the darkness, the smell of burnt silicon filling her nostrils. She felt a strange, terrifying calm. She had just committed a dozen federal crimes. She had destroyed her career. She had humiliated her father's command. But as she looked out the open flap of the tent, she saw the distant, tiny shapes of 1st Platoon. They weren't in the square. They were scrambling up the side of a ridge, their heavy gear discarded, their bodies moving with the frantic energy of people who had just been told they were about to die. They were alive. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Her heart was beating at a steady, controlled 60 beats per minute. She felt the weight of the ceramic plate against her chest. She felt the cold reality of what came next. "Specialist Miller," Graham's voice came through the dark, trembling with a mix of fury and terror. "You are under arrest." "I know, sir," Sarah said. She didn't look at him. She looked at the mountains. "But you might want to call my father. Tell him the Sughat infrastructure project just went live." The silence in the tent was absolute. In the distance, the first shots of the ambush began to ring out, the hollow, rhythmic pop of AK-47s. But the 1st Platoon was on the high ground. They had their rifles. They had their lives. And Sarah Vance, the general's daughter who didn't exist, had finally found her own signal. The next hour was a blur of shadows and the smell of ozone. Without electricity, the TOC was a tomb. The only light came from chemical glow sticks cracked by the MPs, casting a sickly neon green hue over the wreckage of the communications suite. Sarah sat on a folding chair, her hands zip-tied behind her back. She didn't struggle. She didn't protest. She watched the chaos with the detached observation of a bird watching a storm. Graham's was pacing, his shadow looming large against the canvas walls. He was trying to coordinate a defense using runners and hand signals, his voice cracking with the strain of a man whose world had been built on the reliability of the send button. Outside, the sound of the engagement was intensifying. The 1st Platoon was holding the ridge, but the valley floor was swarming with militia. "You've compromised this entire mission, Miller," Graham's hissed, leaning into her space. The green light made his eyes look like empty sockets. "You realize that, don't you? You've destroyed millions of dollars of equipment. You've defied a direct order. You'll spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth." "The equipment was already dead, Major," Sarah said. Her voice was the only calm thing in the room. The pulse was a terminal event. If I hadn't signaled, the first platoon would have been trapped inside their strikers when the systems fried. The doors are electronic, sir. They would have burned alive in steel boxes. Grahams flinched. He knew she was right, and that knowledge was clearly more painful to him than the arrest. He turned away, shouting for an update from the perimeter. Thorne was leaning against the tent pole, his arms crossed. He wasn't looking at Grahams. He was looking at Sarah. He saw the way she sat, back straight, chin up, her eyes never losing their focus. He saw the Vance in her, though he didn't have the name for it yet. He just saw a soldier who had sacrificed everything for a truth no one else was brave enough to hear. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thorne asked quietly, stepping closer when Grahams was occupied. "Tell you what, Staff Sergeant? That you knew exactly what that signal was, that you weren't guessing." Sarah looked at him. For a moment the mask slipped. "Because in this army, Sergeant, a specialist isn't allowed to be right, especially not about things a general is wrong about." Thorne opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of a heavy helicopter drowned him out. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of a Black Hawk. It was the deep, chest-rattling roar of a Chinook, the workhorse of the army. But it was flying low, too low, its landing lights cutting through the dust like searchlights. The bird touched down on the edge of the FOB, the rotor wash nearly collapsing the TOC tent. A few minutes later, the flap was thrown back, and a group of men entered. They weren't wearing the dusty ops of the 82nd. They were wearing clean Class B uniforms, their brass polished, their faces set in grim masks of authority. In the center of the group was General Arthur Vance. He looked older than he had on the tarmac at Liberty. The dust of the valley had already settled into the lines of his face, making him look like a statue carved from salt. He didn't look at the wreckage of the TOC. He didn't look at Grahams, who was stammering an explanation. He looked straight at Sarah. The silence that fell over the tent was different this time. It wasn't the silence of failure, it was the silence of a collision. "Major," Vance said, his voice cutting through Graham's babbling. "Leave us. Sir, she's under arrest, she—" "I said leave us," Vance repeated. The command was absolute. Grahams, Thorne, and the MPs backed out of the tent. The general's security detail stood at the entrance, their backs to the room. Arthur Vance walked over to Sarah. He stood over her for a long time, his shadow falling across her face. He looked at the zip ties on her wrists. He looked at the specialist rank on her chest. He looked at the name tape, *Miller*. "Sarah," he said, it wasn't a greeting, it was a realization. "General," she replied, "you joined the army." "I did. Under your mother's name. It's my name too," she said. Vance turned away, walking to the destroyed console. He touched the burnt edge of a monitor. "They're calling this a catastrophic intelligence failure. The Pentagon is in an uproar. My orders, the orders I signed, sent this unit into a localized EMP trap, a trap that was funded by the very grants I authorized." "I tried to tell them," Sarah said. "I put it in the report. I signaled the anomaly in the 400 megahertz range." Vance turned back to her, his eyes narrowed. "I saw that report. I saw a note about a pump jack harmonic. It was dismissed as environmental noise. I didn't write it as a pump jack," Sarah said, her voice rising for the first time. "I wrote it as a dead-hand protocol. I used the technical specifications for the electric blanket system. Someone edited it, Father. Someone simplified it for the general's summary, because nobody wanted to tell you that your stabilization project was actually a weapon." Vance froze. The word father seemed to hit him harder than the news of the EMP. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in her life, Sarah saw a crack in the armor. He saw the woman she had become, not the daughter he could mold, but the soldier he had accidentally created. "You broke radio silence," Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You used a master override. You humiliated the chain of command in front of the entire division." "I saved the first platoon," Sarah said. "And I saved your career, though you don't realize it yet. If they had died in those strikers, the investigation wouldn't have stopped at the colonel level. They would have followed the money all the way back to your office in Great Falls. Now, you can claim you sent an advance element to test the grid and that the protocol worked." Vance stared at her. He was a man who had spent 40 years playing the game of power, and he saw the move she was making. She was giving him a way out. She was offering him a lie that would keep his stars in exchange for— "What? Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "You hate what I represent. You left because you couldn't stand the institutional blindness." "I left because I wanted to be a soldier, not a trophy," Sarah said. "And as a soldier, my loyalty is to the mission. The mission is to hold this valley. We can't do that if the commander is being hauled back to D.C. in chains." She stood up despite her bound hands. She faced him eye to eye. You're going to sign a new order, General. You're going to authorize a manual sweep of the power lines. You're going to use the 1st platoon, who are currently the only ones who know the terrain, to secure the substations, and you're going to do it without the digital grid. Vance looked at her for a long beat. He was the general, she was the specialist, but in the green glow of the chemical sticks it was clear who was leading. "And what about you, Specialist Miller?" he asked. "You've committed a dozen court-martial offenses." Sarah looked at the zip ties on her wrists. "The report will say that I was acting under a classified directive, a directive you issued verbally before the deployment. You were testing the unit's responsiveness to a total comms failure. It was a drill, General, a very expensive, very successful drill." Vance let out a short, dry laugh. It was a sound of genuine surprise. "You really are my daughter, aren't you?" "No," Sarah said, her voice like iron. "I'm the soldier you sent to die. I'm just better at staying alive than you expected." Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. He stepped forward and cut the zip ties. The plastic snapped and Sarah rubbed her wrists, the feeling returning to her fingers. "Major Graham's?" Vance shouted toward the tent flap. The major scrambled back inside, followed by Thorne. They looked between the general and the specialist, their eyes wide. "Major," Vance said, his voice regaining its public resonance. "Specialist Miller was acting under my specific, compartmented instructions to test the unit's EMP readiness. Her actions today saved this mission from a catastrophic technical oversight. You will strike all records of her arrest. You will commend her for her performance under pressure." Graham's jaw dropped. "Sir, but the equipment, the radios, are a small price to pay for the readiness of my troops," Vance said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Now get me a map of the power substations. Specialist Miller will brief me on the manual sweep. We have a valley to take." Thorne looked at Sarah. He saw the ghost of a smile on her lips, not a smile of joy, but a smile of dark competence. He realized then that he didn't know her at all. He realized that the most dangerous thing in the Sughat Valley wasn't the militia or the EMP. It was the woman who had just outmaneuvered a general in the dark. Sarah stepped over to the map. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at Graham's. She looked at the Sughat Valley. "The 1st substation is here," she said, her finger pressing into the paper. "It's guarded by a 72 beat per minute heart rate. Let's go put it into cardiac arrest." As the sun finally cleared the ridges of the mountains, flooding the valley with a harsh, unforgiving light, Sarah Vance knew the cost of what she had just done. She had saved her father's career, but she had tied herself to him in a way she had spent 3 years trying to escape. She had won the battle, but the war for her own identity had just become a lot more complicated. But as she heard the 1st platoon's voice coming through a hand-cranked field radio, alive, angry, and ready to fight, she knew it was a cost she would pay every single time. The general's daughter had just become the general's teacher, and part 1 of the Sughat stabilization had only just begun. The smell of burnt copper and ionized air was still thick enough to taste when Sarah stepped out of the TOC tent and into a world that had suddenly, violently, reverted to 1944. The morning sun was a pale, sickly disk, struggling to pierce the haze of dust kicked up by the EMP's secondary effects, the literal combustion of 1,000 small transformers across the valley floor. To her left, a row of Humvees sat like dead prehistoric beasts, their electronic ignitions melted into useless slag, while a young private frantically hammered at a door handle that had fused shut. There was no shouting yet, only the terrifying, heavy silence of a modern military that had just lost its nervous system. Sarah adjusted the strap of her M4, the weight of the rifle comforting in its mechanical simplicity, and looked toward the ridge where 1st platoon was invisible but for the intermittent, rhythmic flashes of muzzle fire. She didn't need a radio to know they were low on ammunition. She could hear the change in their shot cadence, the transition from suppressive fire to the disciplined, desperate picking of targets. Staff Sergeant Thorne caught up to her near the motor pool, his breathing heavy and ragged, his face smeared with the soot of a destroyed world. He didn't look at her like a specialist anymore. He looked at her the way a man in a sinking ship looks at the person holding the only bucket. He stopped 3 feet away, his hands twitching near his sidearms, his eyes scanning the perimeter before settling on hers with a piercing, uncomfortable intensity. He had known her for 6 months, had watched her scrub floors and translate boring transcripts, but the woman standing in front of him now, the woman who had just stared down a 3-star general in a dark tent, was a stranger he had been sleeping in the same barracks with. The general's aides are trying to get the satellite phone in the armored Suburban to work. Thorne said, his voice a low rasp. They don't realize the shielding on those things is rated for a solar flare, not a localized, high-frequency pulse directed through the power lines. They're wasting time, Miller, or whatever your name is. It's Miller today, Staff Sergeant, Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the village of Alfara. The names don't matter. What matters is the Phase 2 trigger. The dead hand protocol isn't just about the EMP. It's a handshake. If the signal doesn't reset within 60 minutes of the pulse, the secondary state initiates. Thorne wiped a hand across his brow, leaving a streak of black grease. What secondary state? The grid is gone. They won, didn't they? They leveled the playing field. They didn't level it, Sarah said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register that made her feel like she was watching the world through a telescope. They tilted it. We're blind and deaf, but we're still here. The secondary state is area cleansing. It's a Soviet concept, Sergeant. If you can't hold the territory and you can't see the enemy, you make the territory uninhabitable for everyone. She pulled a crumpled, hand-drawn map from her cargo pocket, a map she had started the night she first heard the 72-beat pulse at Fort Liberty. She smoothed it out against the hood of a dead truck. Thorne leaned in, his shoulder brushing hers, the scent of stale coffee and old gunpowder radiating off him. He pointed to a series of dots she had marked in red ink along the Sughat River, which snaked through the center of the valley like a cold, gray vein. The dams, Thorne whispered, the realization hitting him with the weight of a physical blow. There are 3 of them, small irrigation grade built during the 80s. They are not irrigation dams, Sarah said. They are gravity-fed reservoirs. If the manual sluice gates are triggered by the secondary signal, they don't just flood the valley. They create a slurry of mud and rock that will take out every bridge between here and the extraction point. First platoon is on that ridge, Sergeant. If those dams go, they're cut off on an island of rock with no way down and no way out. Thorne looked at the ridge, then back at the TOC where General Vance was likely already drafting the official version of the morning's disaster. Graham's won't listen. He's already trying to figure out how to blame the contractor for the equipment failure. He won't authorize a move toward the dams without a direct order from the general, and the general is currently busy being a general. I'm not waiting for Graham's, Sarah said. She reached into her vest and pulled out a small, handheld compass, a brass-cased Kamenga she had taken from her father's desk when she was 12. It was an old-school piece of kit, immune to magnetic pulses, its needle steady and true. I'm going to the first substation. It's 4 miles out. If I can manually override the sluice gate before the timer hits 0, I can stop the chain reaction. 4 miles of open valley with no comms, no CAS, and a militia that knows we're blind. Thorne asked. He didn't sound like he was trying to stop her. He sounded like he was calculating the odds. He reached out and touched the map, his thick finger lingering on the first red dot. You won't make it a mile alone. You're a linguist. You can't navigate a hot zone by yourself. I grew up navigating the Shenandoah on foot with nothing but a map and a canteen because my father thought character was built in the wilderness. Sarah said, her eyes meeting his. I know how to disappear, Staff Sergeant. I've been doing it my whole life. Thorne stood in silence for a moment. He looked at the chaos of the FOB, the useless tech, the panicked officers, and then he looked at the woman who had seen the truth through the static. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh magazine for his sidearm, sliding it home with a definitive metallic click. My first tour was in the Korangal, Thorne said, his voice barely audible over the distant gunfire. I had a lieutenant who thought the GPS was God. He walked us into a blind canyon because the screen said there was a path. We lost 4 men that day. I told myself if I ever saw someone who actually knew where the hell they were going, I'd follow them until my boots rotted off. He adjusted his vest, his posture shifting into the stance of a man who had made a terminal decision. I'm driving. We'll take the old M151 Jeep the mechanics use for parts. It's got a mechanical fuel pump and a point ignition system. It'll run even if the sun falls out of the sky. Sarah didn't thank him. She didn't have to. The bond between them had been forged in the SIF over 3 weeks of shared silence and the mutual recognition of competence. She just nodded once, a sharp, professional acknowledgement. They moved through the FOB with the purposeful invisibility of people who belonged there. No one stopped them. The camp was in the middle of a systemic nervous breakdown. They found the M151 tucked behind a stack of shipping containers. It was a relic, a flat-fendered ghost of the Vietnam era covered in a layer of fine desert silt. Thorne hopped into the driver's seat and yanked the manual choke. He pumped the pedal 3 times, a rhythmic prayer, and turned the key. The engine groaned, coughed a cloud of blue smoke, and then settled into a rough, rattling idle that sounded like a beautiful, defiant roar in the silence of the dead valley. "Load up," Thorne said. Sarah threw her pack into the back and climbed into the passenger seat, her M4 held low across her lap. As they rolled toward the perimeter gate, she saw her father standing on the steps of the command trailer. General Vance was looking out over the valley, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as rigid and unyielding as the mountains. He saw the jeep. He saw her. For a split second, their eyes locked across the distance, the commander and the specialist, the father and the ghost. He didn't raise a hand to stop them. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, a man watching his last hope drive into a storm he had helped create. He knew where she was going. He knew why. And in that moment, Sarah saw the most devastating truth of all. He was letting her go because her success was the only thing that could save his legacy, and her death was the only thing that could bury his mistake. They cleared the gate and hit the dirt track that led toward the Sughat River. The valley was beautiful in a way that felt like a threat. The jagged limestone cliffs were draped in shadows, and the air was still, devoid of the usual hum of drones or the distant throb of jet engines. It was a primitive landscape now, one where the only thing that mattered was the weight of lead and the speed of a man's pulse. "Keep your eyes on the tree line," Thorne said, his hands steady on the thin steering wheel. "The militia didn't just set off that pulse for fun. They're moving. I can feel it." "I hear them," Sarah said. Thorne glanced at her. "You hear them? We're in a rattling jeep, Miller." "I don't hear the people, Sergeant. I hear the birds. They've stopped singing in the wadi up ahead. Something's pushing them toward the river." Thorne didn't question her. He shifted gears, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the brush. They were 2 miles out from the first dam when the world exploded in a spray of gravel and the staccato rip of a PKM machine gun. The first burst shattered the jeep's windshield, sending glass shards into Sarah's lap. Thorne didn't panic. He yanked the wheel, sending the small vehicle into a controlled skid behind a low outcropping of rock. They were out of the seats before the jeep had even stopped moving, hitting the dirt and rolling into a defensive position. "Left side, 200 yards. Thorne barked, his M4 finding the gap in the rocks. Sarah didn't fire immediately. She breathed. 1, 2. She felt the vibration of the earth through her palms. She wasn't looking for the muzzle flashes. She was looking for the rhythm. The PKM was firing in long, undisciplined bursts, the mark of a shooter who was excited, not professional. But behind that sound there was another, a steady, single-shot rhythm from a different position, a sniper. "Thorne, don't pop up," Sarah said, her voice a whip crack. "The PKM is the bait. There's a Dragunov at 2 o'clock, high on the ledge." Thorne froze, his head inches below the line of the rock. A second later, a high-velocity round slammed into the stone exactly where his forehead would have been, sending a spray of limestone dust into his hair. "Good eye," Thorne grunted, his breath hitching. "Can you see him?" "I don't need to see him," Sarah said. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small, handheld signal mirror, another piece of her father's survival training. She caught the morning sun and flashed it once, twice, 3 times toward a point 50 yards to the right of the sniper's suspected position. "What the hell are you doing?" Thorne hissed. "Giving him a different pattern to look at," Sarah said. As the sniper shifted his aim toward the intermittent flashes of the mirror, Sarah rose in a single, fluid motion. She didn't use a scope. She didn't have time. She relied on the architecture of the moment. She saw the glint of the Dragunov's lens, the slight movement of a tan shawl against the gray rock. She squeezed the trigger once. The M4 kicked against her shoulder, a familiar, honest jolt. The tan shawl vanished. The PKM fire sputtered and died as the machine gunner realized his cover was gone. "Move," Sarah said, sliding back into the jeep. Thorne was already behind the wheel. They roared out from behind the rock, the little jeep bouncing over the uneven ground as they raced the clock. Sarah checked her watch. 22 minutes until the Phase 2 trigger. The air was getting colder as they approached the river, the mist from the water rising to meet the dust of the valley. The first dam, Station Alpha, was a brutalist slab of concrete wedged into a narrow gorge. It looked like an abandoned tomb, overgrown with scrub and stained by decades of mineral deposits. At the top of the dam sat a small, square control shack, its windows dark and forbidding. "There's the substation," Sarah said, pointing to a metal structure 50 yards from the dam's edge. The manual override is in the basement of that shack. If the signal has already hit the solenoids, the gates are going to start opening the second the timer hits 0. Thorne parked the Jeep behind a stand of gnarled trees. He grabbed a satchel of thermite charges from the back, gear he had liberated from the demo locker before they left. I'll hold the perimeter. You do your voodoo with the wires. How long do you need? If the system is still mechanical, 5 minutes, Sarah said. If the pulse fused the relays, I'll have to blow the hinges on the gates themselves. You have 10 minutes until that ridge becomes a waterfall, Thorne said. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Miller, if this goes south, if the gates open, you get out of there. Don't let the water take you just because you're being stubborn. Sarah looked at him. She saw the history in his eyes, the ghosts of the men he'd lost in the Korangal, the weight of a career spent following orders that didn't make sense. She realized then that Thorne wasn't just helping her. He was trying to save himself from another memory he couldn't live with. I'm not being stubborn, Staff Sergeant, she said. I'm being precise. She ran for the control shack, her boots pounding against the concrete. The air here smelled of wet stone and ancient, stagnant water. She reached the door and kicked it open, her rifle leading the way. The room was empty, filled only with the hum of a battery-powered backup system that shouldn't have been there. She saw it then, the dead hand unit. It was a sleek black box bolted to the wall, its LED display glowing with a steady, malevolent red. It was modern, it was clean, and it was patched directly into the dam's old Soviet infrastructure. The timer on the display was counting down, *0842, 0841. Sarah dropped her pack and pulled out a multi-tool. She didn't try to hack the box, she knew better. The encryption would be a nightmare, and she didn't have the hardware. Instead, she looked at the wires. She saw the pattern, the way the cables were routed through the floorboards. They weren't just controlling the sluice gates, they were monitoring the water pressure. It was a closed-loop system. She knelt on the floor, her fingers moving with the delicate grace of a concert pianist. She wasn't thinking about the general or the 82nd or the court-martial that was waiting for her back home. She was thinking about the heartbeat, the 72 beats per minute. She found the primary solenoid wire. It was a thick, shielded cable that disappeared into a lead pipe. She clamped her multi-tool onto it, but she didn't cut. If she cut it, the fail-safe would trigger the gates immediately. She had to trick the box into thinking the gates were already open. Outside, a burst of gunfire erupted. Thorne was engaging targets near the bridge. Miller, we've got company, he roared. 3 technicals coming down the north road, you need to hurry. Sarah didn't answer, she couldn't, she was focused on the vibration of the wire. She could feel the electrical current humming through the shielding, a low, rhythmic pulse. It was the same frequency as the clutter she had heard in the SIF. She pulled a small, copper wire from her kit, a simple jumper she had fashioned from a radio antenna. She needed to bypass the relay, but the timing had to be perfect. She had to match the pulse of the dead hand's signal exactly, or the system would detect the drop in resistance. *0612, 0611. The gunfire outside was constant now. She heard the heavy thud of a grenade, the shockwave rattling the windows of the shack. Thorne was outmatched. He was one man with an M4 against a militia force that knew they were defending the trigger. Miller, now would be a good time. Thorne's voice was strained, the sound of a man who was running out of dirt to hide behind. Sarah closed her eyes. She put her ear against the lead pipe. She listened to the hum. It wasn't just noise, it was music. A dark, mathematical symphony. She waited for the skip, the tiny microsecond of silence between the pulses that her synesthesia allowed her to perceive. There. She jammed the copper jumper into the relay housing at the exact moment of the skip. The LED on the black box flickered. The red light turned amber. The timer continued to count down, but the active light went dark. "Override engaged," she whispered. She didn't stop to celebrate. She grabbed her rifle and ran for the stairs. She hit the ground floor just as a technical, a Toyota pickup with a mounted DSHK machine gun, roared onto the dam's crest. Thorne was pinned behind the Jeep, his ammunition clearly running low. Sarah didn't aim for the driver. She aimed for the technical's fuel tank. She fired a 3-round burst, the tracers streaking through the gray morning light. The truck erupted in a fireball, the force of the explosion sending the machine gunner flying into the reservoir. Thorne didn't waste a second. He was up and moving, his rifle spitting fire as he retreated toward the shack. "Did you get it?" "Alpha is neutralized," Sarah said, catching him by the vest and pulling him behind the concrete wall. "But there are 2 more. Bravo and Charlie. If they aren't overridden, the pressure differential will blow the Alpha gates anyway. We have 5 miles to the next one and 4 minutes on the clock. Thorne looked at the Jeep, which was now riddled with holes and leaking oil. He looked at the smoking wreck of the Technical. Then he looked at Sarah. "We aren't going to make it by road," he said. "I know," Sarah said. She looked at the river. The Sughat was a fast-moving, cold torrent swollen by the recent rains. On the far bank, a narrow maintenance path used by the dam workers followed the waterline, cutting through the gorge and bypassing the main roads. It was a path meant for goats and desperate men. "The Jeep won't fit," Sarah said. "Then we run," Thorne said. He reached into his pack and handed her 2 fresh magazines. He looked at her, his face a mask of grim determination. "You ever run 5 miles in full kit, specialist?" "Every morning since I was 18, Sarah said. "Good, because if we're a second late, we're going to find out how well we can swim in body armor." They started to run. The path was a nightmare of loose shale and low-hanging branches. Sarah's lungs burned, the dry air of the valley clawing at her throat. Every step was a calculation, the weight of the rifle, the balance of her vest, the rhythm of her breathing. She didn't think about the pain. She focused on the 72 beats. She turned her heart rate into a metronome, matching her stride to the pulse she had defeated. Thorne was a shadow beside her, his movements heavy but relentless. He was a man of iron and gristle, and he refused to fall behind. They ran through the silence of the gorge, the only sound the pounding of their boots and the rush of the river beside them. As they rounded the bend toward Station Bravo, Sarah saw the problem. The bridge leading to the second dam had already been demolished. A span of 60 feet of churning water lay between them and the control substation. On the other side, she could see the second dead hand unit, its red light blinking like a malevolent eye in the distance. Asterisk 0245, 0244, asterisk the bridge is out. Thorne yelled, sliding to a halt at the edge of the jagged concrete. Sarah looked at the water. It was deep, fast, and filled with the debris of the EMP, dead branches, pieces of metal, and the silt of the valley. She looked at the maintenance cable, a thick steel wire that still spanned the gorge, used for moving equipment across the river. It was 100 feet in the air, swaying in the wind. "The cable," Sarah said. Thorne looked up, his face pale. "You've got to be kidding me. We don't have harnesses. We don't even have a carabiner." "We have rifle slings," Sarah said. She didn't wait for his approval. She unclipped the heavy nylon sling from her M4. She looped it over the cable, the metal clip snapping shut with a sound that felt like a death sentence. She looked at Thorne. "If you fall, the current will take you to the first dam," she said. "The sluice gates are still closed. You'll be crushed against the concrete." "And if I stay here, I get to watch the first platoon drown," Thorne said. He unclipped his own sling, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at the cable, then at her. "After you, specialist." Sarah jumped. The world vanished into a blur of gray steel and rushing water. The nylon sling burned against her palms as she slid down the incline of the cable, the friction generating a heat that she felt through her tactical gloves. She was 100 feet above the abyss, a single pixel of camouflage hanging by a thread. She didn't look down. She looked at the red light on the far bank. She hit the far side with a bone-jarring impact, her boots slamming into the rock. She scrambled up the slope, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't look back to see if Thorne had made it. She couldn't afford the second. She reached the Bravo substation. The door was locked with a heavy industrial pad bolt. She didn't have time for the multi-tool. She leaned her rifle against the door and fired a single round into the lock mechanism. The metal shattered and she kicked the door open. Inside, the dead hand was identical to the first. Asterisk 0112, 0111. Asterisk, she didn't need to listen this time. She knew the rhythm. She knew the architecture. She jammed the copper jumper into the relay, her hands steady, her mind a cold, calculating machine. The light turned amber. She turned around and saw Thorne collapsing through the doorway, his face white, his hands bleeding through his gloves. He looked at the timer. Asterisk 0058. Asterisk 2 down, he wheezed. 1 to go. "Charlie is a mile away," Sarah said. "We won't make it on foot, not in 50 seconds. She looked out the window. Below the substation, a small, flat-bottomed boat, a maintenance skiff, was tied to a rotting wooden pier. It was a simple boat used for clearing debris from the intake grates. It had a small outboard motor. "The boat," Sarah said. They scrambled down the bank, the shale sliding beneath them. They hit the pier, the wood groaning under their weight. Sarah jumped into the skiff and grabbed the pull cord of the motor. She yanked it once, twice. The motor sputtered and died. Asterisk 0032. Asterisk, "Come on, you piece of junk." Thorn roared, shoving the boat off the pier and into the current. Sarah yanked the cord a third time, her shoulder screaming with the effort. The motor caught, a high-pitched whining scream that echoed off the canyon walls. She slammed it into gear, the boat surging forward against the current. The third dam, Station Charlie, loomed ahead of them. It was the largest of the three, a massive wall of concrete that held back the bulk of the reservoir. If this one opened, it didn't matter what she had done at Alpha and Bravo. The volume of water would be enough to erase the valley floor. Asterisk 0015. Asterisk the boat hit the concrete base of the dam with a sickening crunch. Sarah didn't wait for it to stabilize. She leaped onto the maintenance ladder, her fingers clawing at the cold metal. She climbed with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, her body a blur of motion. She reached the top deck. The control shack was 50 yards away. Asterisk 0008, 0007. Asterisk she ran. The wind whipped her hair across her face, the sound of the river a deafening roar in her ears. She reached the shack and threw herself at the door. It was already open. Inside, a man was standing at the console. He wasn't a militiaman. He was wearing a clean, gray jumpsuit, and he was holding a tablet that was patched directly into the dead hand unit. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She saw his finger hovering over a manual override button on the tablet, not a bypass, but a trigger. Asterisk 0003. Asterisk she tackled him, the force of her momentum sending both of them crashing into the metal racks. The tablet skittered across the floor. Sarah pinned him with her knee, her hand finding the copper jumper in her pocket. Asterisk 0002. Asterisk she reached for the relay, but the man grabbed her wrist, his strength surprising. He was younger than he looked, his face twisted in a mask of fanatical devotion. "It has to happen," he screamed. "The cycle must be broken." Sarah didn't argue, she didn't preach. She drove her forehead into the bridge of his nose, the sound of cartilage snapping a sharp, wet asterisk pop asterisk. He slumped back, his grip loosening. Asterisk 0001. Asterisk Sarah jammed the jumper into the relay. The timer hit asterisk 0000 asterisk. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the LED display. She waited for the sound of the sluice gates opening, the roar of the water that would mean her death and the destruction of the first platoon. The display flickered. The red light went dark. A single green word appeared on the screen, asterisk stalled asterisk. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah slumped against the console, her chest heaving, the adrenaline beginning to drain out of her like water from a broken glass. She looked at the man on the floor. He was unconscious, blood leaking from his nose onto the pristine gray of his jumpsuit. She looked at the tablet. It wasn't local. The interface was sophisticated, a high-level military-grade software that didn't belong in a dusty valley in the middle of nowhere. Thorn appeared in the doorway, his rifle at the ready, his chest heaving. He looked at the timer, then at the man on the floor, then at Sarah. "The gates are closed," Sarah said, her voice a hollow whisper. Thorn walked over to the window. He looked out toward the ridge. The first platoon's muzzle flashes were still visible, but the intensity had changed. The militia was retreating. Without the flood to cut off the Americans, their ambush had lost its teeth. They were melting back into the shadows of the mountains, leaving their dead behind. "We did it," Thorn said, his voice cracking. He looked at Sarah, a strange, profound respect in his eyes. "You did it, Miller." Sarah didn't answer. She was looking at the tablet. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. She navigated to the source folder. She saw a logo, a small, stylized eagle over a globe. It wasn't a militia symbol. It was the logo of a private defense contractor based in Arlington, Virginia. A contractor that her father had spent the last 5 years championing in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The realization was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. The electric blanket wasn't just a trap built by the enemy. It was a field test, a live environment evaluation for a system designed to be sold to the highest bidder. And her father hadn't just signed the deployment order, he had authorized the test. The first platoon hadn't been an invading force, they had been the lab rats. "Thorn," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "Yeah, we need to get back to the FOB. We will, just give me a second to catch my breath." "No," Sarah said, standing up, her eyes hard and bright. "We need to get back now, before the general realizes we found the trigger man." She looked out the window. In the distance, she saw a helicopter approaching. It wasn't a Chinook. It was a small, sleek MH-6 little bird painted entirely black with no markings and no transponder. It was heading straight for the Charlie substation. "They're coming to clean up the evidence," Sarah said. She looked at the unconscious man. She looked at the tablet. She knew then that the mission wasn't over. It had just changed. The enemy wasn't in the village of Al-Fara. The enemy was in the TOC. She grabbed her rifle and checked the magazine. "Staff Sergeant, how many grenades do you have left?" Thorne looked at her, the exhaustion vanishing from his face as he saw the expression on hers. He knew that look. It was the look of a woman who had just crossed a line she could never go back over. "2," he said. "Why?" "Because we're going to need a distraction," Sarah said. As the black helicopter banked over the reservoir, its door guns beginning to pivot toward the control shack, Sarah Vance felt the last piece of the girl she used to be vanish. She wasn't just a specialist anymore. She wasn't just a daughter. She was a witness. And in the world her father had built, a witness was the most dangerous thing of all. She looked at Thorne. "You ready to commit a little more insubordination?" Thorne smiled, a dark, jagged expression that showed every one of his years. "Miller, I've been waiting my whole career for a reason this good." The first rounds from the little bird's minigun slammed into the concrete roof above them, a sound like 1,000 hammers striking an anvil. Sarah didn't flinch. She adjusted her grip on her M4, her eyes fixed on the door. The gap between what she knew and what the world believed had just become an abyss, and she was the only one with a bridge. The story was no longer about saving the first platoon. It was about surviving the people who had sent them there. Sarah stepped into the light, the 72-beat pulse of the world finally, mercifully replaced by the steady, cold rhythm of her own resolve. "Move," she said, and as they dove for cover, the sound of a new, even more dangerous signal began to rise from the silence of the valley. It was the sound of a secret that refused to stay buried. It was the sound of the real war beginning. The first burst of 7.62 mm fire from the little bird's minigun didn't sound like a weapon. It sounded like the earth itself was being unzipped by a giant, serrated blade, starting with the roof of the control shack and ending 3 inches from Specialist Sarah Miller's left boot. The vibration didn't just travel through the floor. It traveled through her bones, a low-frequency hum that her mind immediately translated into a jagged, neon-violet streak across her vision. In the world of her synesthesia, the sound of the minigun was a violent, rhythmic strobe, a strobe that told her exactly where the pilot was aiming before the rounds even impacted. She didn't think. She didn't wait for Thorne to give an order that he was too stunned to formulate. She lunged across the small room, her fingers locking onto the collar of the unconscious man in the gray jumpsuit, and yanked him toward the heavy steel desk bolted to the center of the floor. "Down! Thorne, get down!" She screamed, though her own voice felt distant, a thin reed against the hurricane of lead. The second pass of the helicopter was more precise. The pilot was no longer just area-denying. He was hunting. The rounds punched through the concrete walls as if they were made of damp cardboard, sending a spray of pulverized stone and white dust into the air. Sarah pressed her face into the cold, grit-covered floor, her body shielding the tablet she had tucked under her chest. Beside her, Thorne was a mountain of trembling muscle, his M4 clutched to his chest, his eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling as it began to sag under the weight of the assault. The smell of ionized air and pulverized concrete was overwhelming, a dry, choking fog that tasted like the end of the world. She could see it in her mind. The 72-beat pulse of the dead hand was gone, replaced by the chaotic, high-pitched whine of the little bird's turbine. The helicopter was banking for a third run, the pilot's electronic signature a sharp, electric blue flare in her peripheral vision. He was coming back to finish the job, to erase the evidence, the witness, and the specialist who had dared to fix what was meant to stay broken. "They're not stopping," Thorne gasped, his voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. He looked at the man Sarah had dragged to the desk, the man with the broken nose and the Arlington contractor logo on his chest. "Miller, they're going to level this shack. We have to move." "The maintenance shaft," Sarah said, her voice a flat, dead calm that surprised even her. She pointed to a heavy iron grate in the corner of the floor, half hidden by a stack of old Soviet manuals. "It leads to the inspection galleries inside the dam. If we get into the concrete, he can't touch us with the miniguns." Thorne didn't argue. He kicked the manuals aside and jammed the muzzle of his rifle into the gap in the grate, heaving upward with a grunt of pure, adrenaline-fueled strength. The iron groaned, resisting for a heartbeat before it gave way, revealing a dark, vertical shaft with a rusted ladder disappearing into the gloom. The smell of damp stone and ancient, stagnant air rose to meet them, a cold, subterranean breath. "Go," Thorne barked. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the tablet, shoved it into the front of her vest, and rolled the unconscious contractor toward the hole. He was a dead weight, a sack of grain in a gray jumpsuit, but she didn't care about his comfort. She dropped him into the shaft first, watching him slide 5 feet down to a small landing before she swung herself over the edge. As her boots hit the rungs of the ladder, the roof of the control shack finally surrendered. A Hellfire missile, launched at point-blank range from the little bird's pylon, slammed into the structure. The explosion was a blinding white wall of sound that turned the violet streaks in Sarah's vision into a solid, agonizing sheet of gold. The pressure wave slammed into her back, throwing her off the ladder. For a terrifying second, she was falling through total darkness. The air ripped from her lungs, the world reduced to the sensation of gravity and the taste of copper. She hit the concrete landing with a jarring impact that sent a white-hot spike of pain through her hip and shoulder. Above her, the opening to the shaft was a jagged circle of orange flame and falling debris. She heard Thorne scream her name, a desperate raw sound, before a massive slab of the shack's floor collapsed, sealing the shaft with a final, echoing thud. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. Sarah lay on the cold concrete, her breath coming in short, ragged hitches. Her vision was a blurred mess of static and fading gold. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough fabric of the contractor's jumpsuit. He was still there, still breathing, a low, wet rasp that was the only sound in the dark. She tried to move, but her hip flared with a brilliance that made her stomach turn. She stayed still, forcing her heart rate down, forcing the 72-beat rhythm back into her mind to stabilize the chaos. "Thorne," she whispered. Her voice was a dry croak, barely louder than the drip of water somewhere deep in the gallery. There was no answer. Only the muffled, distant throb of the helicopter circling the wreckage above, searching for any sign of life in the burning tomb she had just escaped. She was alone. She was injured. She was 100 feet underground in a Soviet-era dam that was no longer on any map. And she was holding the only evidence that could bring down a 4-star general and a billion-dollar defense empire. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her small, tactical flashlight. She clicked it on, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. The landing was small, a 6x6 square of reinforced concrete. The walls were weeping moisture, covered in a thick black mold that looked like velvet in the artificial light. Ahead of her, a narrow tunnel stretched into the heart of the dam, a gallery of pipes, valves, and shadows. She looked at the contractor. His name tag read *K Vance *. The name didn't register at first, not until she saw the small, silver signet ring on his right hand, the same ring her father wore, the one with the family crest from a lineage of soldiers that stretched back to the Civil War. This wasn't just a contractor. He was a cousin, a nephew, someone her father had trusted to oversee the evaluation from the ground. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was genetic. Sarah leaned her head back against the cold wall and closed her eyes. The pain in her hip was a dull, throbbing red now, a color she could work with. She hadn't just saved the first platoon, she had stumbled into the center of a dynastic crime. Her father hadn't just authorized a test, he had kept it in the family. "Wake up," she hissed, grabbing the man by the front of his jumpsuit and shaking him. He groaned, his eyes flickering open under the harsh glare of the flashlight. He squinted, his face contorting in pain as he looked at her. It took a moment for his brain to catch up to the reality of the tunnel, the blood, and the woman holding him at gunpoint. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. Is that you?" "Shut up, Kevin," she said, her voice as cold as the stone beneath them. She didn't have room for family reunions. "You're going to tell me exactly how to get out of this dam without using the main exits, and then you're going to tell me exactly what's on this tablet." "You don't understand," Kevin said, a thin trail of blood leaking from his nose. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. The pulse was supposed to be a demonstration, a proof of concept. The militia, they weren't supposed to be that close. The general said the valley would be clear." "The general lied," Sarah said. She stood up, her hips screaming, her jaw clenched so hard she thought her teeth might crack. She used the wall for support, her M4 hanging from its sling, ready to be brought up in a heartbeat. "The general always lies when the stakes are this high. Now move, before the air in here runs out or the extraction team finds another way down." They moved through the gallery like ghosts, the flashlight beam bouncing off the rusted iron of the internal sluice controls. The air was getting thinner. the smell of damp earth growing stronger. Sarah could feel the weight of the water on the other side of the concrete, millions of tons of pressure held back by a wall that was never meant to survive an EMP and a hellfire strike. She could hear the structure moaning, a deep, subsonic vibration that her synesthesia interpreted as a dark, bruising purple. The dam was failing, not because she had failed to stop the gates, but because the foundation itself had been compromised by the shock waves. Every step was a battle. Sarah's leg felt like it was being scorched by an open flame, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She drove Kevin ahead of her, his hands bound with a zip tie she'd found in her kit. He stumbled, he complained, he begged her to listen to reason, but she was deaf to anything but the rhythm of the escape. After 20 minutes of winding through the guts of the dam, they reached a heavy, circular hatch. It was an auxiliary drainage port, designed to allow engineers to inspect the lower footings during the dry season. "This is it," Kevin panted, leaning against the hatch. "It leads out to the rock face on the western side of the gorge. There's a narrow ledge that connects to the old logging trail, but it's a 300-foot drop if you slip." "Then don't slip," Sarah said. She grabbed the wheel of the hatch and turned. It was fused with rust, the metal screaming in protest. She threw her entire weight into it, her shoulder popping, the pain a bright electric blue in her mind. Slowly, agonizingly, the wheel began to move. One rotation. Two. A blast of cold, wet air hit her face as the seal broke, carrying the scent of the Sughat River and the distant, fading smell of jet fuel. She stepped out onto the ledge and nearly lost her balance. The world was vertical. The limestone cliffs rose like jagged teeth on either side of the river, the water churning white and violent hundreds of feet below. The ledge was barely 18 inches wide, a crumbling strip of stone slick with mist and moss. Above them, the sky was a bruised charcoal, the sun having finally dipped below the peaks. The little bird was gone, likely refueling or searching the other dams, but the silence of the valley was now filled with the sound of the river, a constant, hungry roar. "Go," she ordered, gesturing for Kevin to lead the way along the cliff. They shuffled along the rock face, their backs pressed against the cold limestone. Sarah kept her left hand on the wall and her right hand on her rifle, her eyes scanning the opposite ridge for any sign of movement. Her synesthesia was her only warning system now. She was listening for the wrong sounds, the mechanical clicks of a spotter's scope or the low-frequency thrum of a distant engine. Halfway across the face, the ledge simply vanished. A section of the rock had fallen away, leaving a 4-foot gap over the abyss. Kevin stopped, his face pale, his body shaking. I can't do it. My hands are tied, Sarah, I'll fall." "You jump or I push you," Sarah said. She didn't feel like a hero, she didn't feel like a soldier. She felt like a predator, one that had been forged in the dark of a sif and tempered in the fire of a burning shack. She reached out and grabbed him by the shoulder, her grip like iron. "I'm going to guide you. When I say now, you leap. If you miss, I'm the last thing you'll ever see. Make it count." "Now," she barked. Kevin jumped, his boots scrambling for purchase on the far side of the gap. He nearly slipped, his body tilting toward the river, but Sarah's hand on his collar yanked him back toward the wall. He collapsed onto the stone, sobbing, his spirit completely broken. Sarah looked at the gap. Her hip was a throbbing mess of agony. She knew if she jumped and landed wrong, the bone would shatter. She just breathed out a cloud of white mist and looked at the path ahead. They reached the logging trail 10 minutes later. It was a rutted, overgrown track that wound down toward the valley floor, hidden by a thick canopy of cedar and pine. It was the long way back to the FOB, a 6-mile trek through territory that was now crawling with both militia and whatever cleanup crews her father had deployed. "We stay off the trail," Sarah said, pushing Kevin into the brush. "We move through the tree line, we head for the old extraction point at Objective Rhino. If there's still a radio working in the valley, that's where the first platoon will try to rally." "They won't be there," Kevin said, his voice hollow. "The orders went out an hour ago. The whole valley is being designated a hot zone. Total denial. Anyone left inside is being treated as an enemy combatant, even the 82nd. Sarah stopped. She turned to look at him, the flashlight beam catching the cold, hard glint in her eyes. "What did you say?" "The general." "He can't have witnesses, Sarah. Not after the EMP failed to clear the board. He's calling it a systemic collapse of command. He's going to say the militia overran the FOB and executed everyone. Then he's going to level the whole valley with long-range artillery from the border." The logic was flawless. It was the area cleansing protocol she had warned Thorne about, but with a new, even more cynical twist. Her father wasn't just covering a mistake, he was performing a reset. He would be the hero who survived the tragedy, the leader who lost his daughter and his men to a barbaric enemy, and the man who then used that tragedy to secure the funding for the very weapons that had caused it. The cost of his legacy was 1,000 American lives. Sarah felt a coldness settle over her that was deeper than the mountain air. It was a clarity that transcended the synesthesia, a realization that she was no longer a part of the United States Army in the way she had been that morning. She was a ghost in a machine that was trying to grind her to dust. "Then we have 3 hours," she said, checking her watch. "The artillery batteries at the border have a standard 3-hour window for target acquisition and fire mission prep after a total comms failure." "You're still going back?" Kevin asked, incredulous. "You have the tablet, you have me, you could just disappear, you know how to do it. You told Thorne you've been doing it your whole life." "I'm not disappearing," Sarah said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "I'm going to find the first platoon, and then I'm going to bring them home." The journey through the woods was a slow-motion nightmare. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind through the pines was a potential threat. Sarah moved with a predatory grace that ignored the protests of her body. She was seeing the world in layers now, the thermal signatures of the animals, the acoustic shadows of the hills, the electromagnetic ghosts of the dead power lines. She was a sensor array in a human skin, and she was hunting for a specific frequency, the sound of the 82nd Airborne. She found it 3 miles from the dam. It wasn't a radio signal. It was the smell of clover and cordite, the specific scent of the 82 ND's standard-issue gun oil and the sweat of men who had been running for their lives. It was faint, drifting on the downhill breeze from a cluster of boulders near the riverbank. "Stay here, don't make a sound," she whispered to Kevin, shoving him behind a fallen cedar. She moved toward the boulders, her rifle at the low-ready. She didn't call out. Calling out was a good way to get a bullet in the throat. Instead, she whistled, a short, 3-note bird call that her father had taught her when they hunted turkey in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a family signal, one she knew he had passed on to his favored officers as a discreet recognition code. A moment later, a head popped up from behind a rock. It wasn't an officer. It was a young PFC, his face covered in soot and blood, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. "Specialist Miller," he whispered. "Who's with you, Private?" "Sergeant Thorne and 6 guys from 1st Platoon. We thought you were dead, ma'am. We saw the shack go up." Sarah climbed over the rock, her relief so sharp it felt like another injury. Thorne was there, sitting against a stone, his arm wrapped in a bloody field dressing. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw a man who had reached the end of his tether. "Miller," he grunted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I should have known a little fire wouldn't stop you." "Where are the others?" she asked, looking around the small, miserable group. "Dead or scattered," Thorne said. "The militia hit us as we were trying to cross back to the FOB. Then the black helos started strafing anything that moved. We saw them take out a med-evac bird, Miller, our own people. They didn't even give them a chance to land." The men around the circle were silent, their faces masks of shell-shocked disbelief. These were soldiers who had been trained to believe in the chain of command, in the sanctity of the uniform. To be hunted by their own was a trauma that no amount of training could prepare them for. "They're clearing the valley," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the gloom. "Artillery strike is scheduled for 22:00. If we aren't out of the footprint by then, we're part of the official casualty count." "Out where?" a corporal asked, his voice shaking. "The FOB is compromised. The roads are blocked. We're on foot, and we have wounded." Sarah looked at the river. The Sughat was the only path left. It flowed straight through the gorge, past the FOB, and toward the border crossing 20 miles away. It was fast, it was dangerous, but it was the one thing the artillery couldn't hit with precision. "We take the maintenance barges at the lower landing," Sarah said. "They're steel-hulled, engine-driven, and they're heavy enough to survive the rapids. We move under the cover of the mist. The lower landing is crawling with militia," Thorne warned. "And the cleaners will be watching the water." "Then we give them something else to look at," Sarah said. She reached into her pack and pulled out the tablet. She turned it toward Thorne, the screen glowing with a map of the valley's electrical grid, what was left of it. "The EMP didn't destroy the backup generators at the main substation near the gate. If we can remote trigger a secondary surge through the local lines, we can light up the valley like a Christmas tree. It'll blind their night vision and create enough electronic noise to mask our movement." Thorne looked at the tablet, then at the woman who had become the architect of their survival. "You can do that? From here?" I can do it if I can get within 500 yards of the relay station, Sarah said. It's on the way to the landing. You're barely walking, Miller, Thorne said, gesturing to her blood-stained pants. I'm walking well enough, she said. She looked at the men, her eyes lingering on each of them. None of you asked for this. None of you deserve to be left behind in a hole so a general can keep his pension. We're going home, all of us. The human moment inside the chaos was a small thing, but it felt like the most important thing in the world. The PFC, the boy who had first seen her, reached into his vest and pulled out a battered, half-melted Hershey bar. He broke off a piece and handed it to her. My mom sent it, he said, his voice small. She said the 82nd always needs more sugar. Sarah took the chocolate. It tasted like wax and dust, but as she chewed, she felt a flicker of the girl she used to be, the girl who believed that people were essentially good, even when the world was trying to prove otherwise. She nodded to the boy, a silent thank you that meant more than any medal. Load up, she said. We move in 5. The trek to the substation was a masterclass in tactical stealth. Sarah led the way, her synesthesia allowing her to navigate the soundscapes of the woods, avoiding the patrols that were moving like clumsy giants through the underbrush. She could see the heat of their cigarettes, the hiss of their radio static, the heavy, rhythmic thud of their boots. She steered her small band of survivors through the gaps in the enemy's net, a ghost leading ghosts. They reached the substation at 21:15. It was a fenced-in complex of humming transformers and high-tension wires, guarded by a squad of the general's contractors. They were professionals, moved with purpose, stayed in their sectors, kept their comms short. We can't take them all, Thorne whispered, looking through his optics. Not without making enough noise to bring the whole valley down on us. I don't need to take them, Sarah said. She was looking at the power lines, the thick cables that disappeared into the darkness toward the dam. I just need to touch the frequency. She crawled forward, leaving her rifle with Thorne. She moved with the agonizing slowness of a snake, her hip dragging against the gravel. She reached the perimeter fence and found the primary grounding wire, a thick copper braid that disappeared into the earth. She pulled the tablet from her vest and connected it to the wire using a modified jumper. Her fingers were steady, but her heart was racing, a 120-beat-per-minute hammer against her ribs. She navigated the contractor's software, her mind translating the code into colors. Red for the firewalls, blue for the bypasses, a brilliant, terrifying yellow for the core command. She found the emergency surge protocol. It was a fail-safe designed to clear ice from the lines during winter storms by dumping the entire reserve of the dam's capacitors back into the grid. She looked at her watch. 21:40. In 3 minutes, she whispered into her radio, the world is going to get very bright. When it does, run for the landing. Don't look back. She hit the enter key. The result was more spectacular than she had imagined. A massive blue-white arc of electricity erupted from the substation's primary transformer, lighting up the valley with the brilliance of 1,000 suns. The sound was a deafening asterisk crack asterisk that felt like the sky was being torn in half. The guards at the substation were thrown back by the sheer force of the electromagnetic pulse, their night vision goggles exploding in a spray of sparks. Across the valley, the dead power lines began to glow with a malevolent, ghostly light as the surge traveled toward the dam. The electronic noise was absolute, a screaming white-hot wall of interference that crashed every radio, every drone, and every targeting system within 10 miles. Move! Sarah screamed. She scrambled back toward Thorne, the world around them a chaotic mess of shadows and strobe lights. They ran. They ran through the blinding light, through the panicked shouts of the militia, through the tall grass that was now singing with static. They reached the lower landing as the first artillery flares began to bloom in the sky, the pre-fire signals from the border batteries. The barges were there, 2 massive steel hulks tied to the concrete pier. Get them on, now! Thorne roared, shoving the wounded men onto the lead barge. Sarah was the last to reach the pier. She looked back toward the FOB, which was now a distant, glowing ember in the center of the valley. She saw the silhouettes of the little birds, their pilots struggling to maintain control as their electronics fried in the surge. She jumped onto the barge just as Thorne slammed it into gear. The heavy diesel engine groaned, a beautiful mechanical roar that cut through the electrical screaming of the valley. The barge pulled away from the pier, the current of the Sughat catching the hull and swinging it toward the center of the river. They were moving. They were escaping. But the maximum pressure moment hadn't arrived yet. It arrived when the first artillery shell, A 155 high-explosive round slammed into the riverbank 50 yards behind them. The shockwave lifted the back of the barge out of the water, sending Sarah sprawling across the steel deck. The sky was no longer charcoal. It was a screaming orange, filled with the whistling freight train sound of incoming fire. Her father had moved up the timeline. He wasn't waiting for 2200. He was sanitizing the valley now. "They're bracketing us," Thorne yelled over the roar of the water. "He knows we're on the river." Sarah stood up, her vision swimming, the world a chaotic blur of orange and black. She looked toward the prow of the barge. Ahead of them, the river narrowed into the Devil's Throat, a series of Class V rapids that wound through a canyon so deep the artillery couldn't reach the bottom. But the entrance to the throat was blocked by a massive, fallen tree, a casualty of the EMP and the flood. "We're going to hit it," the PFC screamed, pointing at the massive trunk of the cedar that spanned the narrow gap. If they hit the tree, the barge would stall, and if they stalled, they were sitting ducks for the next volley of shells. Sarah looked at the tree. Then she looked at the dead hand tablet, which was still glowing in her hand. The battery was at 4%. "Thorne, give me the thermite," she yelled. "What?" "The thermite, give it to me." Thorne reached into his pack and tossed her the satchel. Sarah didn't think about the math. She didn't think about the risk. She grabbed the satchel and ran for the prow of the barge. She climbed onto the very edge of the steel plating, the spray from the river drenching her to the bone. The tree was 50 feet away, 40, 30. She didn't just throw the thermite, she used the tablet. She knew the tree was leaning against a high-tension pylon that had been weakened by the surge. If she could trigger one more discharge, the heat would ignite the thermite and the pylon would collapse, dragging the tree with it into the depths of the gorge. She timed the beat. Asterisk 1, 2, 3. Asterisk, she threw the satchel. It landed perfectly in the tangle of branches resting against the pylon. At the same moment, she jammed the last command into the tablet. A total discharge of the remaining capacitor bank. The world vanished into a pillar of white fire. The thermite ignited with a brilliance that made the artillery flares look like candles. The pylon shrieked, the metal melting in a matter of seconds, and then the entire structure, tree and all, vanished into the churning white water of the Devil's Throat. The barge surged forward, clearing the gap by inches. A second later, they were in the canyon, the towering walls of limestone rising up on either side to shield them from the artillery. The sound of the shells became a distant, muffled thud, a color of bruised indigo that faded into the blackness of the gorge. They were in the dark. They were in the rapids, but they were alive. Sarah collapsed against the side of the barge, her hand still clutching the dead tablet. She felt the vibration of the engine through the steel, a low, steady rhythm that finally, mercifully, matched her own heartbeat. She looked at Thorne, who was standing at the tiller, his face a mask of grime and exhaustion. He looked back at her, and for a long moment neither of them said a word. The human cost was etched in every line of his face, the cost of their standing, their careers, and the people they had lost. But in that silence there was also a victory, a quiet, classified victory that would never be written in any history book. The immediate aftermath was a surreal blur. The barge carried them through the night, the river a cold, relentless ribbon of gray. They reached the border crossing at dawn, a small, sleepy outpost manned by a group of confused National Guardsmen who had no idea the valley behind them had been turned into a graveyard. Sarah stood on the riverbank, her uniform torn, her hips screaming, her hair matted with blood and dust. She watched as the first platoon survivors were loaded into ambulances. She saw Thorne being led away by a medic, his hand lingering on her shoulder for a second, a touch that said everything he couldn't find the words for. She was left standing by the water, the tablet tucked under her arm. She saw the black subs approaching from the north. She saw the men in the suits, the official version of the morning arriving to claim the narrative. And at the center of the group, she saw her father. General Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle. He looked at the valley where the smoke from the artillery was still rising in a series of dark, vertical columns. Then he looked at her. He didn't move. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just stood there, his face a mask of professional concern, his eyes searching hers for any sign of the girl he had raised. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't hide the tablet. She didn't beg for his forgiveness or his protection. She just stood there, a specialist in a world that didn't understand her, holding the truth in her hands like a cold, sharp blade. The reckoning hadn't arrived yet. The court-martial, the investigations, the long, slow war of attrition in the halls of power, that was all still to come. But as Sarah Vance looked at her father, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer his ghost. She was his judge. She turned away from him and walked toward the ambulances, her head up, her stride rhythmic and steady. The 72-beat pulse of the world was finally quiet. In its place, there was only the sound of her own boots on the gravel, the sound of a woman who had found something inside herself that no general, no contractor, and no EMP could ever destroy. She was still standing, and that was the only thing that mattered. The nurse at the Wounded Warrior Pavilion at Fort Belvoir had a name tag that said Miller just like Sarah's, and she smelled of peppermint and industrial-grade bleach when she reached down to adjust the morphine drip at 03:14 on a rainy Wednesday morning. The sound of the plastic tubing clicking into the pump was a sharp, percussive violet in Sarah's mind, a flicker of light that pulsed in perfect sync with the dull, throbbing red of the 3 titanium screws they had just driven into her pelvic bone. It had been 6 days since the Sughat Valley vanished into a cloud of white phosphorus and high-explosive artillery fire. And in that time, the world had become a series of white walls, muffled voices, and the persistent, low-frequency hum of a building that was trying very hard to pretend she didn't exist. The hospital room was a sensory vacuum designed for recovery, but for Sarah, it was a battlefield of frequencies. The fluorescent lights overhead weren't just bright. They hummed at a 60-cycle frequency that translated into a jagged, electric chartreuse line across the back of her eyelids. Every time a door opened in the hallway, the pressure change felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She lay perfectly still, her hands resting on top of the thin, waffle-weave blanket, her fingers tracing the invisible patterns of the air. She didn't need the morphine, but she let them administer it because it softened the colors. It turned the jagged chartreuse into a soft, rolling moss green, making the silence of the isolation ward almost bearable. She wasn't on a standard surgical floor. She was in the North Wing, a section of the hospital that didn't appear on the public directory, a place where the guards at the door wore ops and carried sidearms instead of stethoscopes. There was no television in the room. There were no flowers. There was only a single reinforced window that looked out over a gray parking lot and the distant, rain-blurred silhouette of the Potomac River. The institutional response had begun the moment she stepped off the C-17 at Andrews Air Force Base. It hadn't been a medical evacuation. It had been a retrieval. While the other survivors of the 1st platoon were being processed through the standard channels at Landstuhl, Sarah had been diverted. They told her it was because of the complexity of her injury, a specialized orthopedic consult, available only in D.C. But the 2 men in dark suits who had walked alongside her gurney the entire way told a different story. They were the kind of men who didn't have names, only titles, and their presence was a silent, suffocating weight that had followed her into the operating room and back out again. The door to her room opened with a soft, hydraulic hiss. Sarah didn't turn her head. She didn't have to. The sound of the footsteps was heavy, measured, and carried the specific, metallic resonance of someone who spent their life in high-gloss low quarters. It was a 74-beat gait, a rhythm she knew as well as her own name. It was the sound of her father. General Vance didn't speak for a long time. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind his spine. The rain streaked the glass, turning the lights of the parking lot into distorted, weeping diamonds. In Sarah's mind, his presence was a deep, bruising indigo, a color that filled the room and pushed the moss-green morphine haze into the corners. "The surgeons say you'll walk with a cane for 6 months," he said finally. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of gravel being ground under a heel. "After that, they aren't sure. The nerve damage in the hip was more extensive than the initial scans showed." Sarah stared at the ceiling. "I'm not interested in the prognosis of my gait, Dad. I want to know where Sergeant Thorne is." The indigo shifted, darkening. "Master Sergeant Thorne has been reassigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment's training detachment at Fort Moore. He received a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in the valley. He's a hero, Sarah. The Army takes care of its heroes." "You mean you bought him?" Sarah said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the anger she felt. The anger was a sharp, white light held tightly in the center of her chest, behind a wall of disciplined control. "You gave him the promotion and the medal he's wanted his whole life, and in exchange, he signed the non-disclosure. He signed the report that says the EMP was a militia-built device using scavenged Soviet tech. He signed the report that says the Sughat Dam collapsed due to structural neglect." General Vance turned around. He looked older than he had a week ago. The lines around his mouth were deeper, and the silver at his temples seemed more pronounced under the sterile hospital lights. But his eyes were still the same, cold, tactical, and entirely focused on the objective. "It's the only report that exists, Sarah," he said quietly. "The tablet you brought back was damaged beyond recovery. The salt water from the river, the electrical surge you triggered, the internal storage was fused. There is no evidence of an American-made prototype. There is no evidence of the Arlington contractor's involvement. There is only a tragedy that we are working very hard to move past." Sarah felt a small, cold smile touch the corners of her mouth. She didn't tell him that the fused tablet was a decoy she had swapped into her vest at the lower landing. She didn't tell him that the real hardware was currently buried in a waterproof Pelican case 6 inches beneath a cedar tree 3 miles from the border crossing, marked by a frequency only she could hear. She let him believe he had won. It was the only way to stay alive in this room. "And the men we lost?" she asked. "The first platoon boys who are currently in body bags because they were accidental casualties of an artillery fire mission that was never supposed to happen. The families are being taken care of," Vance said, his voice hardening. "They will receive the full honors of a combat death. Their names will be on the wall at Bragg. They are being honored for their sacrifice in the face of an overwhelming enemy. That is the story. That is the truth the country needs. Do you have any idea what would happen to the defense budget, to our standing in the Pacific, to the very stability of the Department of the Army if the truth you're holding onto was made public? It would be a decapitation strike on the entire chain of command. Maybe the chain of command needs to be decapitated if it's willing to murder its own to protect a contract," Sarah said. Vance stepped closer to the bed. He didn't look like a father. He looked like a man who was calculating the cost of a nuisance. "You've always been difficult, Sarah, even as a child. You saw things other people didn't, and you thought that gave you the right to judge them. But this isn't a playground. This is the world, and in the world we make choices. I made a choice to protect the future of American electronic warfare. You made a choice to play the martyr. Only one of those choices has a future." He reached into the pocket of his blouse and pulled out a small blue velvet box. He set it on the bedside table, next to the plastic cup of water and the bowl of untouched lime jello. "The Silver Star," he said. "For gallantry in action, for saving the lives of your fellow soldiers under heavy fire. The citation is already written. It's a beautiful piece of prose. It mentions your courage, your technical proficiency, and your dedication to the mission. It's the career maker you've earned." Sarah looked at the box. In her mind, the blue velvet glowed with a sickening, oily yellow light. It was the color of a lie. "And the cost of the medal?" "A signature," Vance said. "On a psychiatric evaluation. We've already cleared it with the board. You'll be medically retired at 100% disability. Post-traumatic stress disorder with associated sensory hallucinations. It explains your synesthesia, the colors you see, as a coping mechanism for the trauma of the valley. It protects you, Sarah. It means no one can ever question your mental state during the event because the event was so horrific it broke you. You get the pension, the medal, and a quiet life in Virginia. And in return, you stop talking about things you don't understand." "You're discrediting me before I even speak," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of a flawless tactical maneuver. By labeling her as mentally unstable, they ensured that even if she did find a way to leak the truth, it would be dismissed as the rambling of a broken soldier who had spent too much time in the dark. "I'm saving you," Vance countered. "This is the only way out of this ward. Sign the papers, and you're a hero. Don't, and you're a permanent ward of the state in a facility that doesn't have windows. I can't protect you forever, Sarah. The people I work for, they don't have my sentimentality." He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. The indigo presence left the room with him, leaving Sarah in the cold, chartreuse hum of the hospital. The door hissed shut, and the silence that followed was heavier than the morphine. Hours later, the peppermint and bleach nurse returned. She moved with a rhythmic 60-beat step, a soothing lavender color in Sarah's mind. She checked the vitals, checked the drainage tube in Sarah's hip, and then leaned in close, her voice a whisper that barely disturbed the air. "There's a man in the cafeteria," the nurse said, her eyes fixed on the heart monitor. "He's been there for 18 hours. He doesn't have a visitor's pass for this wing, but he hasn't moved. He says he was with you in the gorge. He told me to tell you that the chocolate was still good." Sarah felt a surge of warmth, a bright golden-orange spark in the center of her chest. The PFC, the boy who had given her the Hershey bar. He was alive. He was here. He was the one person the general's machinery hadn't been able to scrub yet. "Tell him," Sarah paused, her throat tight. "Tell him to keep the wrapper. Tell him I'm coming out." The nurse nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and then she was gone. The next 3 days were a lesson in the slow, grinding machinery of institutional erasure. Sarah was visited by a rotating cast of specialists. There was the JAG officer, a woman with a voice like dry parchment who explained the legal implications of the non-disclosure agreement in a way that sounded like a threat. There was the psychiatrist, a man who smelled of expensive cologne and spoke to her in the overly gentle tone one might use with a wounded animal, asking her to describe the colors she saw when he clapped his hands. He took meticulous notes, his pen scratching against the paper with a sound like a swarm of insects, a buzzing, gray noise that made her teeth ache. They were building the case against her reality, brick by brick. Every time she answered a question, they twisted it. If she described the electronic signature of the EMP, they recorded it as a visual hallucination triggered by acute stress. If she mentioned the Arlington contractor, they noted her fixation on perceived conspiracies. She watched them do it. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. She played the part of the controlled, broken soldier. She spoke in low tones, she kept her eyes on her hands, and she let them believe the morphine was doing its job. But inside, behind the mask, she was mapping the facility. She was listening to the frequencies of the hospital. She knew the shift changes by the sound of the elevator cables. She knew when the security guards did their rounds by the rhythmic clack of their boots on the linoleum. She knew the frequency of the electronic locks on the doors, a high-pitched, 15,000 hertz whine that she could feel in the bridge of her nose. On the fourth night, the personal cost of the Sughat Valley finally arrived in full. The doctors came in to remove the drainage tubes and the heavy bandages from her hip. For the first time, Sarah was allowed to stand. It took 3 of them to help her out of the bed. When her left foot touched the floor, the world exploded into a blinding, agonizing sheet of white light. The pain wasn't just physical. It was a sensory overload that threatened to shatter her mind. The titanium screws felt like they were vibrating against the bone, a discordant, screeching frequency that drowned out everything else. She didn't scream. She didn't even moan. She gripped the edge of the walker until her knuckles were white, her jaw clenched so hard she could taste the copper of her own blood. She stood there, trembling, her body a map of trauma, while the doctors watched her with clinical detachment. "The gait will be uneven," the head surgeon said, his voice a dull, brown rumble. "The left leg is effectively a 1/4 inch shorter now due to the pelvic reconstruction. You'll have a permanent limp specialist. It's a significant disability." Sarah looked at her reflection in the small, stainless steel mirror above the sink. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with red. There was a jagged scar running from her temple to her jaw, a souvenir from the falling debris in the control shack. But it was her eyes that were different. The light in them was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that looked like tempered glass. She wasn't a girl from Montana anymore. She wasn't a specialist in the 82nd. She was something else, something forged in the fire of betrayal and the cold of the gorge. "I can walk," she said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't shake. "With assistance," the surgeon corrected. "I can walk," she repeated, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. She took a step, then another. Each one was a battle against the white light of the pain. She forced her mind to compartmentalize the sensation, to turn the agony into a color, a deep, burning crimson, and then to push that color into the background. She walked to the window, the metal walker clack-shuffling against the floor, a rhythmic, mechanical sound that she began to use as a metronome. 1, 2, breathe. 1, 2, breathe. She looked out at the Potomac. The rain had stopped and the moon was a pale, silver sliver in the sky. She thought about Thorne, sitting in a training shack at Fort Moore, wearing a medal that felt like lead. She thought about the boys in the 1st platoon, their stories buried under a mountain of redacted paperwork. And she thought about the general, sitting in his office at the Pentagon, believing he had successfully sanitized the world. He had forgotten one thing. He had taught her how to hunt. He had taught her that the most effective weapon isn't the one that makes the most noise. It's the one that changes the frequency of the entire battlefield. The reckoning for the authority figures began the next afternoon, though they didn't know it yet. It started with a man named Colonel Holloway. Holloway was CID, Criminal Investigation Division, but he wasn't part of the fixer crew. He was an old-school investigator, a man who had spent 30 years chasing ghosts through the Army's darkest corners. He arrived at her room without a suit, wearing a faded flight jacket and carrying a cardboard cup of bad coffee. His presence was a steady, earthy brown in Sarah's mind, a color that felt honest and unhurried. He sat in the guest chair and didn't open a notebook. He just looked at her for a long time. "I was at the Sughat Dam 20 years ago," he said, when it was still a join-top site with the locals. It was a hell of a piece of engineering, built to withstand a nuclear strike. I saw the satellite photos of the collapse, Specialist Miller. That dam didn't fall because of structural neglect. It was hit with a concentrated thermal surge at the primary footing. Sarah didn't move, she didn't blink. "The official report says otherwise, Colonel." "The official report is a work of fiction," Holloway said. He leaned forward, the smell of stale coffee and tobacco smoke drifting toward her. "I've been doing this a long time. I know the smell of a cover-up. It smells like fresh paint and high-level signatures. But what I don't know is why a specialist from the 82nd is being held in a SIF-capable medical ward while the general who authorized the mission is being shortlisted for the Joint Chiefs." "Maybe you should ask the general," Sarah said. "I did," Holloway replied. "He told me you were a hero who had a mental breakdown. He told me the investigation was closed. But then I found something interesting. I found a requisition order for a specialized signal processing unit, signed by a shell company in Arlington, delivered to the Sughat Valley 48 hours before the event. The unit was never recovered, and neither were the 3 contractors who were supposed to be operating it." Sarah felt a shift in the room. The brown of Holloway's presence was sharpening, turning into a hard, metallic bronze. He wasn't just curious, he was hunting, too. "One of those contractors was Kevin Vance," Sarah said quietly. Holloway's eyes narrowed. "The general's nephew. I couldn't find his name on the manifest. It was scrubbed." "He was in the shack with me," Sarah said. "He told me everything. He told me the EMP was a demonstration. He told me the militia was supposed to be a variable to prove the weapon could distinguish between friendly and enemy signatures. He told me the general knew the valley wasn't clear." Holloway was silent for a long beat. The only sound in the room was the hum of the lights and the distant siren of an ambulance. "If that's true, if you can prove that, it's not just a cover-up, it's a war crime." "I can't prove anything," Sarah said, her voice a hollow echo. "The evidence is gone. My credibility is being systematically destroyed by a board of psychiatrists. In 48 hours, I'll be retired with a PTSD diagnosis, and anything I say after that will be treated as a symptom of my breakdown." Holloway stood up. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the handle. "There's a hearing on Monday, a closed-door session of the Senate Armed Services Committee. They are reviewing the Sughat incident as part of the general's confirmation process. It's supposed to be a formality, a victory lap." He turned to look at her, his bronze presence steady and resolute. "I can't get you into that room, specialist. I don't have that kind of pull. But if you were to somehow find your way to the Hart Senate office building at 0900, if you were to stand in front of those senators and tell them what you just told me, the institution might not be able to protect him anymore." "I'm a prisoner in this ward, Colonel," Sarah said, gesturing to the guard at the door. "The guard is a corporal from the 3rd Infantry," Holloway said. "He has a brother who was in the 1st Platoon. He knows you saved his brother's life. Sometimes the institution isn't as solid as it looks. Sometimes it's held together by people who still remember what the uniform is supposed to mean." He opened the door and walked out. The personal cost of what she was about to do settled on Sarah like a shroud. If she left this room, if she defied her father and the machinery he commanded, there would be no going back. There would be no Silver Star, no pension, no quiet life in Virginia. She would be an enemy of the state, a whistleblower in a world that hated the sound of the truth. She would lose the only family she had left, even if that family was a monster. She spent the night in a state of controlled clarity. She didn't sleep. She spent the hours practicing her walk, forcing her body to move despite the red screams of the titanium in her hip. She used the walker as a weapon, a tool to build the strength she would need to stand on her own 2 feet. At 0200, the door opened. It wasn't the nurse. It was the corporal from the 3rd Infantry. He was a young man with a face full of freckles and eyes that were too old for his age. He didn't say a word. He just set a bag on the foot of her bed. Inside the bag was a set of Class A greens, the dress uniform of the United States Army. It had her name on the chest. It had the 82nd Airborne patch on the shoulder. It had the ribbons she had earned in her 3 years of service. And pinned to the lapel was the Silver Star her father had left on the table. "My brother is in the rehab wing," the corporal whispered. "He says he wants to buy you a beer when you get out of here. He says you're the reason he's still got both his legs." Sarah looked at the uniform. In her mind, it wasn't green. It was a brilliant, shimmering silver, the color of a promise. "Help me get dressed," she said. The process was an agony of slow, precise movements. Every button was a battle. Every adjustment of the skirt made her breath hitch in her throat. But when she was finished, when she stood in front of the stainless steel mirror, she didn't see a patient. She didn't see a broken girl. She saw a specialist of the United States Army. She looked at the walker. She took a deep breath, centered herself in the 72-beat rhythm of the world, and pushed the walker into the corner. She took a step. Her hip flared white, then red, then a deep, throbbing purple. She didn't stop. She took another. She walked to the door, her limp pronounced, her jaw set, her head held high. The corporal opened the door. He didn't look at the security cameras. He didn't look at the other guards. He just walked beside her, his hand near her elbow, a silent support that she didn't touch but felt in every nerve of her body. They moved through the darkened halls of Fort Belvoir like ghosts. They took the service elevator to the loading dock, where a black sedan was waiting in the rain. The driver was Sergeant Thorne. He was wearing his own Class A's, the new Master Sergeant stripes sharp on his sleeve, the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his chest. He looked at Sarah, and for a moment the mask of the professional soldier slipped. His eyes were wet, his face a map of the guilt he had been carrying since the river. "Miller," he choked out. "Thorne," she said. She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't ask how he had found her. She just reached out and took his hand. His grip was a solid, grounding gold, the color of a man who had found his way back to himself. "I couldn't do it," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "I sat in that training shack for 3 days looking at this medal, and I couldn't breathe. I thought about the boys. I thought about you. I realized I'd rather be a PFC with a clean conscience than a master sergeant with a soul made of lead." "Did you bring it?" Sarah asked. Thorne reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, ruggedized hard drive. "Holloway told me where you buried the case. I went back. I crossed the border at night, Miller. I dug it up while the cleaners were still searching the other side of the ridge. It's all here. The raw sensor data, the Arlington comms logs, the general's personal authorization for the secondary surge." Sarah took the drive. It felt heavy in her hand, a physical weight that balanced the pain in her hip. This was the truth. This was the bullet that would finish the job she had started in the control shack. "Let's go," she said. The drive to D.C. was a blur of rain and streetlights. Sarah sat in the back, her eyes closed, her mind focused on the colors of the city. Washington was a chaotic mess of frequencies. The blue pulse of the police cars, the orange hum of the streetlights, the deep vibrating gray of the monuments. It was a city built on power, and as she approached the heart of it, she could feel the weight of the institution pressing down on her. They reached the Hart Senate office building at 08:30. The rain had turned into a cold, gray mist that clung to the marble columns like a shroud. Security was tight, men in suits with earpieces, Capitol Police with dogs, the air thick with the crackle of high-level surveillance. "I can't go in with you," Thorne said, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "The moment I step on that property, I'm AWOL. They'll have me in cuffs before I reach the door." "I know," Sarah said. She looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you for the chocolate, Sergeant." Thorne managed a weak smile. "Go get M specialist for the 1st platoon." Sarah stepped out of the car. The pain in her hip hit her like a physical blow, a white-hot spike that made her vision swim. She leaned against the door for a second, forcing the 72-beat rhythm back into her mind, forcing the crimson agony into a small, manageable box. She walked toward the entrance. She didn't use a cane. She didn't use a walker. She walked with a limp that was as much a part of her uniform as the silver star on her chest. She passed through the metal detectors. She passed through the security checkpoints. She moved with a purpose that ignored the curious looks of the aides and the lobbyists. She was a ghost in the machine, a signal that was never supposed to be received. She reached the hearing room at 08:55. 2 MPs stood at the door, their faces stone cold. "This is a closed session, specialist," one of them said, his hand moving to his holster. "You don't have clearance." "I'm the primary witness for the Sughat Valley incident," Sarah said. Her voice was a flat, dead calm that echoed off the marble walls. "And if you don't open that door, the information on this drive is going to every news outlet in the country before the general can finish his opening statement." The MPs hesitated. They looked at her uniform, at the silver star, at the jagged scar on her face. They looked at the limp, and then slowly one of them stepped aside. Sarah pushed the doors open. The room was large, a cavern of mahogany and gold leaf, filled with the bruised indigo presence of the Senate committee and the military top brass. At the center of the room, standing at a podium in front of a panel of senators, was General Vance. He was speaking. He was describing the tragic loss of his men. He was talking about American resilience and the unwavering commitment to technological superiority. He looked like a god in his four-star uniform, a man who had mastered the frequency of power. Sarah walked down the center aisle. The sound of her boot, the rhythmic thud-scrape of her gait, cut through his voice like a blade. 1, 2, breathe. 1, 2, breathe. The room went silent. The senators leaned forward, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. The cameras, the ones that were supposed to be recording for the archives, flickered with a sudden electronic static as Sarah's synesthesia flared, her mind reacting to the sheer density of the lies in the room. General Vance stopped mid-sentence. He turned, his face turning a ghostly pale as he saw his daughter. He saw the uniform, he saw the silver star, and he saw the hard drive in her hand. For a long moment the world stood still. The indigo and the silver clashed in the center of the room, a violent, vibrating frequency that made the air feel like it was about to ignite. "Specialist Miller," the chairman of the committee said, his voice booming in the silence. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Sarah didn't look at the senator. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight at her father. "The general was just finishing the introduction," Sarah said, her voice clear and resonant, a frequency that cut through the indigo like a sunbeam. "I'm here to provide the data." She reached the podium and set the hard drive on the table. She looked at her father, her eyes reflecting the cold, hard light of the truth. The reckoning had arrived. The cost had been paid. And the girl who had been a ghost in the machine was finally ready to speak. But as she opened her mouth to begin, a secondary door at the back of the room opened, and a man she had never seen before, a man who carried a presence of such absolute, terrifying blackness that it swallowed all the other colors in the room, stepped into the light and raised a single gloved hand. "The witness is mistaken," the man said, his voice a low, mechanical hum that made the floor vibrate. "This session is no longer just about a promotion. It is now a matter of national security. Clear the room." The cliffhanger hung in the air, a dark, unresolved frequency that promised a final truth far more dangerous than anything Sarah had imagined. She looked at the black-clad man, then at her father, who was suddenly looking not at her, but at the door behind her with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The real war had just begun. The silence that followed the black-clad man's command was not an absence of sound, but a crushing, atmospheric weight that felt like the air had been sucked out of the room by a massive, unseen lung. In Sarah's mind, the man's presence was a jagged, light-consuming void, a matte black so absolute it seemed to pull the colors from the mahogany walls and the gold leaf trim of the Senate chamber. The MPs, who had been hesitant only moments ago, snapped into a rigid, terrified obedience that had nothing to do with the chain of command and everything to do with the primal instinct to survive. They began herding the senators and their aides toward the side exits, their voices hushed and urgent, the scuff-shuffle of expensive leather shoes on the thick carpet sounding like dry leaves being blown across a graveyard. General Vance did not move. He stood behind his podium, his hands gripped so tightly on the edges that the wood groaned. The indigo presence that had defined him for Sarah's entire life, the color of authority, of the great man mythos he had cultivated, was bleeding out of him, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at the man in the black suit not as a subordinate or even a peer, but as a condemned man looks at the executioner who has arrived a day early. "Director Miller," the man in black said. His voice was a low-frequency vibration, a 40 hertz hum that Sarah felt in the fillings of her teeth. He wasn't talking to the general. He was looking at Sarah. He used her last name with a specific clinical inflection that stripped away her rank, her history, and her humanity. To him, she was just a biological component of a larger system. Sarah didn't move from the center aisle. The pain in her hip was a steady, rhythmic pulse of violet electricity, but she used it as an anchor, a way to keep herself grounded as the room emptied. She kept her hand flat on the ruggedized hard drive she had placed on the witness table. "The drive stays here," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but it felt thin in the vast, emptying space. The director stepped closer. He didn't walk so much as glide, his movements devoid of the redundant shifts and sways of a normal human gait. He stopped 6 feet away, and for the first time, Sarah saw his eyes. They were a flat slate gray, the color of a winter sky over the Atlantic, utterly devoid of empathy or malice. He was a man who lived entirely in the world of necessity, a place where the cost of a life was a rounding error in a classified budget. The drive is a fragment of a much larger picture you are not cleared to see, specialist, the director said. Your father attempted to manage a prototype demonstration that was beyond his intellectual and tactical pay grade. His failure at the Sughat Dam was a failure of local management, but the technology itself, the frequency you manipulated, that belongs to the agency. It is not a matter for a Senate subcommittee. It is not a matter for public record. It is a fundamental shift in the nature of global electronic dominance. The failure killed 42 Americans, Sarah said. The words felt like stones in her mouth. She looked past the director to her father. He knew the militia was there. He knew the secondary surge would collapse the footing. He did it anyway to see what the weapon could do. And it did exactly what we hoped, the director replied, his voice never rising. It functioned. The collateral damage is regrettable, but in the context of the next 50 years of American warfare, it is statistically insignificant. What is significant, however, is you. Sarah felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The black void of the director's presence expanded, swirling with a faint, pulsing ultraviolet light. He wasn't looking at her uniform or her medal. He was looking at the way her eyes tracked the electronic signatures in the room. He was looking at the way she held her body in sync with the 72-beat rhythm of the building's power grid. You didn't just survive the surge, the director continued, stepping into her personal space. You interfaced with it. The sensor logs from the shack show a modulation in the pulse that shouldn't have been possible. You didn't just shut the weapon down, specialist. You harmonized with it. You redirected the backscatter into your own neural network. That is why you see the colors. That is why you hear the world the way you do. General Vance finally spoke, his voice a cracked, desperate whisper. Voss, she's my daughter. She's injured. She's not part of the program. Director Voss didn't even turn his head. She is the program now, General. You were supposed to secure the hardware. You failed. She is the hardware, and she has proven far more durable than the Arlington prototypes. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The hospital, the psychiatrists, the threat of the psych ward, it hadn't just been about silencing her. It had been an observation period. They weren't trying to fix her, they were trying to calibrate her. Her father hadn't been trying to save her life. He had been trying to negotiate her value. He had traded her medical records and her sensory hallucinations for his own seat at the table. The indigo in the room was gone. Her father was nothing but a shadow, a hollowed-out vessel of a man who had sold the only thing he ever truly owned. Sarah looked at him and felt a sudden, profound sense of mourning, not for the man he was, but for the girl she had been when she still believed he was a hero. Thorne is outside, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He has a copy. If I don't walk out of this building in 10 minutes, the data goes live on a dozen encrypted servers. It was a lie. There was no copy. Thorne was sitting in a black sedan in the rain, holding nothing but a cold cup of coffee and the hope that she would come back. But she said it with the same flat, controlled frequency she used to map a radio signal. She made it sound like a physical law. Voss paused. For the first time, a flicker of something, not fear but calculation, crossed his slate-gray eyes. The ultraviolet pulse in his presence slowed. He looked at the hard drive, then back at Sarah. Master Sergeant Thorne is currently being detained by a specialized recovery team 2 blocks from this location, Voss said. The sedan was intercepted 3 minutes ago. There is no copy. There is only you, the drive, and the choice you are about to make. The world tilted. The violet pain in her hip flared into a blinding white strobe. Thorne was gone. The one person who saw her, the one man who had risked everything to bring her here, was being held in some unmarked van because she had been too slow, too focused on a justice that didn't exist in this city. What do you want? Sarah asked. The words were a surrender, but she didn't say them like a victim. She said them like a soldier acknowledging a change in the tactical environment. The drive, Voss said, and your cooperation. We are moving the research to a facility in West Virginia, a quiet place. No senators, no reporters, just the frequencies. You will be given the best medical care in the world. You will be given a rank that doesn't exist. And in exchange, you will help us understand what you did in that shack. You will help us map the bridge between the human mind and the spectrum. And my father. Voss glanced at the general. The general will retire, today. For health reasons, he will receive his pension and his silence will be ensured by the same NDA that will govern your new life. He will never speak to you again. He will never see you again. To the world, Specialist Sarah Miller died of complications from her injuries at Fort Belvoir. There will be a ceremony, a closed casket, a folded flag for the grieving father. Sarah looked at the general. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his 4 stars finally proving too heavy for his spine. He didn't look up. He didn't fight for her. He didn't even offer a word of apology. He was already calculating his retirement, the golf courses in Florida, the quiet transition into the nothingness he had earned. Sarah looked at the hard drive. She looked at the exit doors where the MPs stood like statues. She looked at the black-clad man who represented the dark, hidden heart of the country she had sworn to protect. She realized then that there was no right choice. There was no version of this story where she won. There was only the choice of which cost she was willing to pay. If she fought, they would kill her here, scrub the room, and take the drive anyway. Thorne would disappear into a black hole. The truth would still be buried. If she went with them, she would become a ghost, a laboratory animal for a weapon that would eventually be used to kill more boys like the first platoon. But if she went with them, she might find a way to break the machine from the inside. She remembered the feeling of the frequency in the Sughat Valley, the way she had touched the pulse, the way she had felt the hidden architecture of the energy. She wasn't just a receiver. She was a modulator. She could change the signal. She reached out and picked up the hard drive. She felt the weight of it, the cold metal against her palm. In her mind, the drive glowed with a faint, flickering amber, the color of a trapped spark. "Let Thorne go," Sarah said. "That is not part of the—" "Let him go," she interrupted, her voice gaining a new, sharp resonance. The fluorescent lights in the ceiling flickered in sync with her words. The hum of the room's electronics rose by an octave. "I know how the prototype works now, Voss. I know the frequency that triggers the logic gate collapse in the primary capacitor. If you don't release Thorne and give me a confirmed signal that he is safe, I will trigger a surge right here in this room. I'll fry every server in the Heart building, including the one in your pocket. I'll turn your precious technology into a pile of melted silicon and bone char." Voss stared at her. The slate-gray eyes widened slightly. He looked at the lights, then at the subtle vibration of the water in a glass on the senator's desk. He realized in that moment that she wasn't bluffing. She wasn't a soldier making a threat. She was a force of nature articulating a reality. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim, black device. He tapped a command. "Release the asset at Site B. Confirm visual of him walking away. Now." A few seconds passed. A soft chirp came from the device. Voss turned the screen towards Sarah. It was a grainy, high-angle surveillance feed of a street corner. She saw Thorne. He was standing on the sidewalk, looking around in confusion, his class a uniform soaked by the rain. He looked shaken, but he was alive. He was free. "He's clear," Voss said. "Now the drive." Sarah handed it to him. As his gloved fingers closed around the metal, she felt a final, sharp pang of loss. It was the last piece of the truth she had to give. She was empty now. She was a ghost. "The car is waiting in the basement," Voss said. He turned to the general. "Go home, Vance. Your car is in the north lot. Don't look back." The general walked out of the room without a word. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at Voss. He just walked, his thud-thud gait sounding like a drum fading into the distance. Sarah watched him go. She felt a strange sense of peace. The indigo was gone. The fear was gone. There was only the silver star on her chest and the cold, gray reality of the road ahead. The journey to the facility in West Virginia took 6 hours. They didn't put her in a cell. They put her in the back of a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who didn't speak. Voss sat in the front, his presence a steady, light-eating void that never wavered. They drove through the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, moving deep into the radio-quiet zone, a place where the air was devoid of the chaotic chatter of cell towers and Wi-Fi. As they crossed the perimeter, the colors in Sarah's mind began to settle. The jagged chartreuse of the D.C. power grid faded. The bruising indigo of the political machine disappeared. The world became a soft, muted palette of forest greens, earthy browns, and the silver gray of the mountain mist. The facility was hidden beneath a decommissioned limestone quarry. It wasn't a bunker. It was a cathedral of glass and steel, buried 300 feet underground. It smelled of cold stone, ozone, and the specific metallic scent of liquid nitrogen. They took her to a room that was entirely white. No corners, No shadows, just a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out onto a pressurized garden of ferns and moss. "This is your home now, Sarah," Voss said, standing at the door. "You are the most important person in this building. My staff will be here in the morning to begin the baseline testing. Rest. You've earned it." The door slid shut with a soft, airtight hiss. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't look at the room. She didn't look at the garden. She looked at her hands. They were steady. The pain in her hip had receded to a dull, manageable thrum, a low-frequency hum that she could live with. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the silence of the mountain. It was a different kind of silence than the hospital. This was a silence that was waiting. It was a silence that held its breath. She realized then what she knew now, the truth that she hadn't understood in the Sughat Valley. The institution hadn't failed her. The institution was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was a machine built to survive, to adapt, to consume anything that threatened its equilibrium. Her father, the senators, the contractors, they were just parts of the engine, and now she was a part of it too. But a machine is only as good as its timing. A single misaligned frequency can bring the whole thing down. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a virus. She was the one signal they couldn't filter out, the one variable they couldn't control. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the colors weren't a storm. They were a map. She could see the entire facility, the power lines, the data cables, the security sensors, all of it glowing in her mind like a neon nervous system. She reached out with her mind, touching the edges of the network, feeling the pulse of the building. She wasn't going to fight them today. She wasn't going to fight them tomorrow. She was going to wait. She was going to learn their frequency. She was going to become the very thing they wanted her to be, until the moment arrived when she could change the signal for good. 3 months later, the world outside the quarry had forgotten Sarah Miller. In a small cemetery in Billings, Montana, there was a new headstone. It was simple gray granite, marked with her name, her rank, and the dates of her birth and her death. There were no flowers on the grave. No one came to visit it. The grass grew long around the base, and the wind from the plains blew dust over the inscription until the letters were barely legible. But 3 miles away, in a small, weathered cabin on the edge of the Gallatin National Forest, a man named Thorne sat on a porch and watched the sunset. He had a dog at his feet, an old black lab with a graying muzzle who spent most of his time sleeping in the sun. Thorne didn't work for the army anymore. He worked for a local logging outfit, clearing brush and marking trees for the winter cut. He was a quiet man, a man who didn't talk much about the past, a man who seemed to be waiting for something that never arrived. Every Tuesday evening at exactly 03:14 in the morning, Thorne would wake up. He didn't know why. His internal clock would just snap open, his mind clear and alert. He would walk to the window and look out at the dark silhouette of the mountains, and for a split second he would see it. A pulse. A faint, shimmering ripple of light in the northern sky, a color that didn't belong in the natural world. It wasn't the aurora borealis. It wasn't a satellite. It was a specific, rhythmic flicker of violet and gold, a signal that pulsed with the steady 72-beat rhythm of a human heart. He never told anyone. He never tried to trace it. He just stood there in the dark, watching the light until it faded back into the stars. He knew what it was. He knew who it was. It was the only thing that kept him going, the only truth in a world that had been built on lies. In the facility beneath the quarry, Sarah Miller stood in the center of a massive, copper-shielded chamber. She was wearing a black bodysuit, her hair cropped short, her face pale and focused. There were electrodes attached to her temples, her wrists, and the scar on her hip. Surrounding her were dozens of technicians and scientists, their faces obscured by masks, their eyes fixed on the monitors that lined the walls. Director Voss stood in the observation booth, his hand resting on the glass. He looked down at her with a sense of possessive pride. To him, she was the ultimate achievement, the bridge to a new era of American power. "Ready for Phase 4, Voss said over the intercom. "Target the relay in the Nevada test range. Give us the full spectrum, Sarah. Show us what you can see." Sarah didn't look up at the booth. She didn't look at the scientists. She looked at the air in front of her. She could see the waves. She could see the trillions of signals that filled the world, the radio broadcasts, the cell signals, the satellite feeds, the encrypted whispers of 1,000 government agencies. It was a chaotic, beautiful, terrifying sea of information. She took a deep breath. She centered herself. She felt the titanium in her hip vibrate, a low, grounding hum that connected her to the earth. She didn't target Nevada. She reached out, her mind expanding, her synesthesia flaring into a brilliant, blinding white light. She touched the primary server in the facility. She touched the backup arrays in Virginia. She touched the deep space relays that govern the agency's global surveillance network. She didn't break them. She didn't fry them. She began to record every file, every redacted name, every secret contract, every collateral damage report from the last 50 years. She pulled it all into herself, modulating the data, turning the black and white text into a symphony of color and sound. She became the archive. She became the living memory of the institution's sins. Voss saw the monitors flicker. "Sarah, what are you doing? The levels are spiking." "Sarah, stand down." She didn't stand down. She pushed harder. The room began to hum, a deep, bone-shaking vibration that made the glass in the observation booth crack. The violet light in her mind expanded, filling the chamber, swallowing the technicians, swallowing the sensors, swallowing the entire world. She wasn't a specialist anymore. She wasn't a ghost. She was the signal. And for a single, glorious moment, she wasn't alone. She felt the first platoon. She felt the boys in the body bags. She felt the families who had been told lies. She felt Thorne sitting on his porch 3,000 miles away. She felt the entire weight of the country she loved, the country that had broken her, and she realized that she was finally strong enough to carry it. The surge lasted for only 3 seconds. When it was over, the facility was dark. The servers were dead. The scientists were huddled on the floor, their ears bleeding, their minds reeling from the sensory overload. Voss stood in the booth, his face a mask of horror. He looked at the monitors, which were showing nothing but static. He looked down at the chamber. Sarah was gone, not physically. She was still standing in the center of the room, her bodysuit smoking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But the light in her eyes was different. The hardware was no longer under his control. The interface had been reversed. She looked up at him. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes, the cold, hard clarity of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and decided to climb back out, was enough. She had the data. She was the data. And as long as she was alive, the machine would never be safe again. Voss knew it. He saw the end of his career, the end of his program, the end of his world in that one look. He reached for the emergency termination button on the console, his hand trembling. But the button didn't work. Nothing worked. The facility was hers now. Every lock, every camera, every life support system was synced to the 72-beat rhythm of her heart. Sarah turned and walked toward the door. Her limp was still there, a rhythmic thud scrape that echoed in the silence of the dead facility. She pushed the heavy steel doors open with a strength that didn't come from her muscles. She walked through the darkened halls. She walked past the armed guards who stood frozen in the hallways, their electronic headsets screaming with a frequency they couldn't shut off. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the surface. As the elevator rose, she felt the mountain falling away. She felt the air changing. She felt the weight of the limestone being replaced by the light of the moon. The doors opened onto the floor of the quarry. The night air was cold and sweet, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Sarah stepped out onto the gravel, her boots crunching in the silence. She looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, a million tiny pinpricks of light in the vast, velvet black. For the first time in years, she didn't see them as frequencies. She didn't see them as data points. She saw them as stars. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was the wrapper from the Hershey bar Thorne had given her in the Sughat Valley. It was faded and torn, the silver foil dull under the moonlight. She held it in her hand for a moment, feeling the texture of it, the memory of the boy who had survived and the woman she used to be. Then she let it go. The wind caught the wrapper, carrying it up into the air, a small silver spark that danced in the breeze before disappearing into the trees. Sarah began to walk. She didn't have a map. She didn't have a plan. She just had the 72-beat rhythm and the knowledge of what she was capable of. She walked away from the quarry, away from the facility, away from the life that had been chosen for her. She walked into the woods, her limp a steady, persistent beat against the forest floor. She was going to find Thorne. She was going to find a way to tell the story. She was going to find a way to be human again, even if she had to rebuild herself one frequency at a time. The cost had been everything. Her name, her family, her body, her future. But as she moved through the trees, the violet light in her mind began to fade, replaced by a soft, warm orange, the color of a campfire, the color of a sunrise, the color of hope. It was a small light. It was a quiet light, but it was hers. 3 days later, in a small town in West Virginia, a woman with a pronounced limp walked into a public library. She sat down at a computer in the corner, her face hidden by a hooded sweatshirt. She didn't look at the other patrons. She didn't look at the clock. She began to type. She didn't type a report. She didn't type a confession. She typed a list of names, 42 names, the names of the men of the first platoon, and then underneath the names she typed a single sentence. Asterisk, they were not accidental casualties. Asterisk, she hit the send button. Across the country, in newsrooms, in law offices, in the private inboxes of senators and generals, the signal arrived. It wasn't an email. It was a data burst of such complexity and density that it bypassed every firewall, every encryption, every security protocol in existence. It was a signal that couldn't be ignored. It was a signal that couldn't be silenced. In the Pentagon, a four-star general's computer screen flickered and died, replaced by a single image. The face of his daughter, her eyes glowing with a cold, silver light. In a black sedan in D.C., Director Voss watched his phone screen dissolve into a chaotic mess of colors, a 72-beat pulse that seemed to mock the very idea of control. And in Montana, Thorne sat on his porch and felt a sudden, sharp vibration in the air. He looked at his hands, which were glowing with a faint golden-orange light. He smiled. He knew what it meant. Sarah Miller walked out of the library and into the sunlight. The world was loud. The world was messy. The world was full of 1,000 conflicting frequencies that she couldn't control, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't just listening. She was the one who was speaking. She walked down the main street of the small town, her thud-scrape gait a steady, defiant rhythm against the pavement. She passed a hardware store, a diner, a small park where children were playing on a swing set. She looked at everything, her eyes tracking the colors of the world with a new, quiet intensity. She reached the edge of town, where the road stretched out toward the mountains. She stopped and looked back one last time. She saw the American flag flying over the post office. It was faded, the red and white stripes blurred by the sun, the blue field a deep, weathered indigo. She looked at it for a long time, remembering the oath she had taken, the uniform she had worn, the people she had lost. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel betrayal. She felt a profound, heavy sense of duty, a duty that went beyond the institution, beyond the chain of command, beyond the country itself. It was the duty of the signal to remain true, no matter how much noise was in the air. She turned and continued walking. She had a long way to go. The men in black suits would be looking for her. The machinery of the state would be trying to find her. The world would be trying to drown her out. But she wasn't afraid. She knew the frequency of the hunt. She knew the rhythm of the escape. And she knew that as long as she kept moving, as long as she kept the 72-beat pulse steady in her heart, they would never be able to catch her. She was Sarah Miller. She was a specialist of the United States Army. She was a survivor of the Sughat Valley. And she was the girl who had seen the colors of the world and decided that the truth was worth the cost of the light. The sun began to set over the Appalachian Mountains, casting long, purple shadows across the road. Sarah walked into the twilight, her limp a steady, rhythmic beat against the asphalt. 1, 2, breathe, 1, 2, breathe. She was alone, she was broken, she was a ghost. But as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she realized that for the first time in her life she could finally hear the silence, and in the silence there was peace. The small, silver star on her chest caught the last rays of the sun, flashing once with a brilliant, shimmering light before the world went dark. She reached the top of the hill and looked down at the valley below. The lights of the distant houses were small and flickering, 1,000 tiny sparks in the vast, deep indigo of the night. She looked at them and felt a sudden, sharp pang of love, a love for the people who would never know her name, for the lives that would be saved by the truth she carried, for the country that was still trying to find its way through the dark. She took a deep breath, the cold mountain air filling her lungs. She centered herself, feeling the 72-bit rhythm of the world pulsing in her veins. She wasn't just a soldier. She wasn't just a signal. She was a memory that refused to be forgotten. She stepped off the road and into the shadows, disappearing into the trees as the first snow of the winter began to fall, the white flakes drifting down like the static of a dead television, silent and cold and perfectly true. The mountains held her secret. The wind carried her name. And somewhere, far away in the tall grass of Montana, an old dog lifted his head and barked at the moon, sensing a frequency that only the loyal can hear. The war was over. The mission was complete. The cost had been paid in full. Sarah Miller kept walking until the only thing left of her was the sound of her footsteps in the snow, a rhythmic, persistent beat that faded into the great, white silence of the American night. The truth is a frequency that once heard can never be unheard.